The world, in the early decades of the 20th century, was still healing from the unimaginable wounds of the Great War. The First World War, which many had hoped would be the war to end all wars, had left deep scars across Europe, Asia, and beyond. Nations were grieving lost generations, economies were strained to the breaking point, and people across continents yearned for stability and peace. Yet beneath this fragile surface of hope, dangerous currents were forming. Discontent, nationalism, and the desire for revenge simmered quietly, waiting for the right moment to erupt into conflict once again. This uneasy atmosphere would eventually give rise to the most destructive war in human history, the Second World War. In Germany, the Treaty of Versailles had ended the First World War, but had also left bitterness, resentment, and humiliation. The treaty imposed crushing reparations, territorial losses, and restrictions on Germany's military power. Many Germans felt betrayed, believing they had been unfairly punished and stripped of their pride. In the years that followed, political instability plagued the Weimar Republic. Economic crises, most notably the Great Depression of the 1930s, brought mass unemployment, poverty, and despair. It was in this climate of anger and hopelessness that Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party, the Nazis, rose to prominence. Hitler promised to restore Germany's strength, rebuild its military, and return honor to its people. His fiery speeches, laced with promises of a brighter future and the dangerous poison of racial superiority, struck a chord with a desperate population. Elsewhere in Europe, fascism was also on the rise. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already established a dictatorship, speaking of reviving the glory of the Roman Empire. His vision of conquest and empire building would later drag Italy into a war it was unprepared for. In Spain, civil war raged during the 1930s, where General Francisco Franco, supported by both Hitler and Mussolini, fought to establish his own authoritarian rule. The Spanish Civil War became a testing ground for new tactics and weapons, a rehearsal for the greater conflict that was to come. Meanwhile, far to the east, the Empire of Japan was expanding aggressively. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, a vast region of northeastern China rich in resources. By 1937, Japan launched a full-scale war against China, capturing cities and leaving devastation in its wake. The infamous Nanjing Massacre shocked the world, as hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed and brutalized. Japan's leaders, driven by a vision of creating a vast empire across Asia, continued to expand their ambitions, looking hungrily at territories controlled by Western powers. As the 1930s unfolded, the world drifted closer to the abyss. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria in what was called the Anschluss. Crowds in Vienna cheered as German troops marched through the streets, but not everyone celebrated. For many, it was the beginning of darker days. Later that same year, Hitler turned his eyes to Czechoslovakia, claiming the Sudetenland, a region with a large German-speaking population. At the Munich Conference, leaders from Britain, France, Italy, and Germany met to try and prevent war. In what became known as appeasement, Britain and France allowed Hitler to take the Sudetenland in exchange for his promise of peace. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, returned home proclaiming that he had secured peace for our time. But peace was an illusion. Hitler's appetite for conquest was far from satisfied. By March 1939, Hitler had broken his word. German troops marched into the rest of Czechoslovakia, seizing control. The world watched with growing alarm, but still, many leaders hesitated, hoping to avoid another devastating war. That hope finally shattered on the 1st of September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland. The Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, had begun. German tanks, aircraft, and troops moved with terrifying speed, overwhelming Polish defenses. Just 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, honoring their pledge to defend Poland. The Second World War had begun, and once again, the world was plunged into chaos. As German forces advanced across Poland, The Soviet Union also moved in from the east, in accordance with the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement signed between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The pact shocked the world, as Hitler and Stalin were bitter ideological enemies. Yet both leaders found temporary advantage in dividing Eastern Europe between them. Poland was crushed, and its people were left to suffer under the occupation of two brutal regimes. Through the autumn of 1939 and into the winter, the war in the West entered a strange period known as the Phony War. Britain and France, though officially at war with Germany, did little to engage militarily. Soldiers waited in trenches along the French border, while civilians braced themselves for the unknown. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, the Soviet Union invaded Finland in November 1939, launching what became known as the Winter War. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the Finnish defenders put up a fierce resistance, using their knowledge of the icy terrain and remarkable ingenuity. The world watched in admiration as small groups of Finnish ski troops harassed Soviet forces, earning a reputation for courage and resilience. In the spring of 1940, the war would erupt into full fury. Hitler's forces swept into Denmark and Norway in April, securing strategic territory and access to iron ore from Sweden. By May, Germany launched a massive invasion of Western Europe. In a matter of weeks, the Nazi war machine stormed through the Netherlands, Belgium, and into France. The speed and ferocity of the Blitzkrieg stunned the world. France, which had been considered one of the strongest powers in Europe, collapsed in just 6 weeks. German troops marched triumphantly into Paris in June 1940 as the French government surrendered. The fall of France left Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany. Across the Channel, Adolf Hitler began preparing for what he called Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of the British Isles. But before German troops could set foot on British soil, they needed control of the skies. Thus began the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, one of the most famous aerial campaigns in history. The German Luftwaffe launched wave after wave of bombing raids, hoping to destroy the Royal Air Force. But Britain's pilots, flying Spitfires and Hurricanes, fought with extraordinary bravery. Known as the Few, their resilience and skill prevented Germany from achieving air superiority. Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister just weeks earlier, praised them with words that would echo through history. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Though battered, Britain survived. Yet the bombing continued. The Blitz nightly bombing raids on London and other cities brought destruction and suffering, but also unity and defiance. Families huddled in shelters, children were evacuated to the countryside, and life carried on amid the rubble. The people of Britain had withstood the onslaught, and Hitler was forced to abandon his plans to invade. Instead, his eyes turned eastward, toward the vast lands of the Soviet Union. But before that fateful move, another stage of the war was already unfolding. Across the Mediterranean and in North Africa, the conflict was spreading, and the world was truly at war. The struggle now extended far beyond the shores of Western Europe. While Britain endured the Blitz and Hitler tightened his grip over the continent, the Mediterranean became a new battleground. Italy, under the leadership of Benito Mussolini, had entered the war in June 1940, hoping to carve out an empire of its own. Mussolini dreamed of reviving the ancient Roman dominion across North Africa and the Balkans, but the Italian military was ill-prepared for the realities of modern warfare. In North Africa, Italian forces stationed in Libya struck across the border into Egypt, seeking to push British forces back toward the Suez Canal, a vital artery of the British Empire. At first, their numbers seemed overwhelming, but within weeks, the weaknesses of the Italian army were exposed. Poorly supplied, inadequately trained, and lacking modern equipment, they were no match for the professional British and Commonwealth troops facing them. In December 1940, the British launched a counteroffensive, sweeping across the desert with surprising speed, capturing thousands of Italian soldiers and pushing deep into Libya. The collapse of Italian fortunes in North Africa forced Hitler to intervene. he dispatched one of his most talented generals, Erwin Rommel, to take command of German reinforcements. Rommel, soon to be known as the Desert Fox, brought with him the Afrika Korps, a mobile and battle-hardened force. With skillful maneuvering and daring tactics, Rommel revitalized the Axis campaign in North Africa. His use of tanks, combined with deception and rapid movement, repeatedly outflanked the British, driving them back across the desert. The war in North Africa became a bitter contest of advance and retreat, with both sides gaining ground only to lose it again, as the shifting sands of the desert bore witness to months of grueling battles. Beyond North Africa, Mussolini also cast his gaze toward the Balkans. In October 1940, he ordered an invasion of Greece, imagining a quick victory. Instead, the Italians were humiliated. The Greek army, though outnumbered, fought back with remarkable determination, pushing the Italians into retreat. It was an embarrassing setback for Mussolini and a dangerous distraction for Hitler. To rescue his ally, Hitler ordered German forces into the Balkans in the spring of 1941. In rapid succession, Yugoslavia and Greece fell to the Wehrmacht. German paratroopers also descended on the island of Crete in May 1941, capturing it after fierce fighting, but at a heavy cost. Thousands of paratroopers were killed, and Hitler resolved never again to commit them to such large-scale airborne assaults. Still, with the Balkans subdued, Hitler's southern flank was secured. But even as the fighting spread across the Mediterranean and the deserts of North Africa, Hitler's ambitions were fixed on a much greater prize. He had long dreamed of conquering the Soviet Union, believing that Germany's future lay in the vast lands of the East. Operation Barbarossa, as it was called, would become the largest invasion in history. On the 22nd of June 1941, Germany and its allies launched a colossal assault across an 1,800-mile front. More than 3 million German soldiers poured into Soviet territory, supported by hundreds of thousands of troops from Romania, Hungary, Finland, and Italy. At first, the offensive seemed unstoppable. Soviet defenses collapsed under the weight of the blitzkrieg, as tanks and aircraft cut deep into enemy lines. Entire Soviet armies were encircled, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured, and vast swathes of territory fell under German control. In the first months, German troops swept through the Baltic states, advanced into Ukraine, and pushed toward the heart of Russia. By autumn, they were at the gates of Moscow. Hitler boasted that the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay, and believed it would collapse within weeks. But the German advance had come at a terrible cost. Supply lines were stretched thin, soldiers were exhausted, and the harsh Russian climate was beginning to take its toll. When winter descended in late 1941, it was the coldest in decades. German troops, ill-equipped for freezing conditions, suffered terribly. Weapons froze, vehicles broke down, and frostbite claimed thousands of lives. At this moment of crisis, the Soviet people rallied. Factories in the east, beyond the reach of German bombers, churned out tanks, planes, and rifles. The Red Army, reorganized under the steel will of Joseph Stalin, stiffened its resistance. In December 1941, Soviet forces launched a counteroffensive outside Moscow, pushing the Germans back. For the first time, the myth of Nazi invincibility had been broken. Hitler's dream of a swift victory was shattered, and the war in the East would become a brutal, grinding struggle that would ultimately determine the fate of the conflict. Even as the German advance stalled before Moscow, events thousands of miles away would change the course of the war. In Asia, Japan had been steadily expanding its empire, occupying large parts of China and eyeing the colonies of European powers weakened by the war. Japan was heavily dependent on imports of oil, steel, and other resources, much of which came from the United States. When America imposed sanctions in response to Japanese aggression, Japan's leaders faced a choice: back down or strike out. They chose war. On the morning of the 7th of December 1941, Japanese aircraft roared over Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, unleashing devastation on the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Battleships were sunk, aircraft destroyed, and thousands killed. It was a shocking attack that stunned the American people. The very next day, the United States declared war on Japan. Soon after, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, bringing the world's most powerful nation fully into the conflict. What had begun as a European war had now become a truly global one. For the Axis, the hope was that America's entry would be too late to change the balance. For the Allies, it was the turning of the tide. American industry, with its vast resources and manpower, would become the arsenal of democracy, supplying weapons, vehicles, and aircraft on a scale never before imagined. As 1942 dawned, the war stretched from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Asia, from the icy steppes of Russia to the stormy seas of the Atlantic. It was a conflict unlike any the world had ever seen, a struggle of nations, ideologies, and empires. Millions of lives had already been lost, and millions more would be sacrificed before the guns finally fell silent. Yet, amid the darkness, there was resilience, courage, and hope. Ordinary men and women across the globe endured hardships, resisted oppression, and dreamed of a day when peace would return. The entry of the United States into the war in late 1941 marked a decisive turning point, but it did not immediately bring relief to the Allies. Across the Pacific, Japan pressed its advantage with remarkable speed. In the months following Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. They seized Hong Kong, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, capturing vital resources of oil, rubber, and tin. In the Philippines, American and Filipino troops resisted bravely, but by May 1942, Bataan had fallen, and the defenders of Corregidor were forced to surrender. Thousands of prisoners were subjected to brutal treatment in what became known as the Bataan Death March, a grim symbol of Japanese cruelty in occupied territories. It seemed for a time as though Japan's advance could not be stopped, but Japan, like Germany, had underestimated the resilience of its opponents. In April 1942, American bombers under Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle launched a daring raid on Tokyo, flying from an aircraft carrier far out in the Pacific. The raid inflicted little physical damage, but it was a profound psychological blow to Japan and a boost to American morale. More importantly, the United States was beginning to marshal its vast resources, building new ships and planes in quantities the Axis powers could never match. In May 1942, the Battle of the Coral Sea halted, a Japanese attempt to capture Port Moresby in New Guinea. Though the battle was tactically inconclusive, it was strategically significant, as it was the first time a Japanese advance had been checked. A month later came an even greater turning point. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, American codebreakers discovered Japan's plans to attack the small island Midway between Asia and North America. Forewarned, Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned his carriers to spring a devastating ambush. In a few fateful minutes, American dive bombers destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, crippling Japan's naval power. The tide in the Pacific had begun to turn. Yet the struggle was far from over. The Japanese fought tenaciously, and the island campaigns that followed became some of the most brutal battles of the war. On Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, U.S. Marines landed in August 1942, seizing an airfield under construction. The Japanese counterattacked with ferocity, launching wave after wave of assaults by land, sea, and air. The fighting dragged on for months in the sweltering jungle, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Finally, in February 1943, the Japanese withdrew. The victory at Guadalcanal signaled that Japan's era of unchecked expansion was over. Meanwhile, in North Africa, the seesaw struggle continued. Rommel's Afrika Korps pressed deep into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal, a lifeline of the British Empire. But in October 1942, at the Second Battle of El Alamein, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery launched a massive offensive. With superior numbers and supplies, Montgomery's 8th Army broke through the Axis lines, driving Rommel into retreat. Winston Churchill hailed the victory, declaring that before Alamein the Allies had never won, but after Alamein they would never lose. The following month, American forces made their debut in the European theater with Operation Torch, landing in North Africa alongside the British. It might have was a baptism of fire, as inexperienced American troops faced seasoned German units, but the weight of Allied numbers told. By May 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa had been crushed, and over 250,000 German and Italian troops surrendered. The Mediterranean was now under Allied control, and the way was open to strike at Europe's soft underbelly. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. Within weeks, Mussolini was overthrown, and Italy surrendered, though German forces quickly moved in to continue the fight. The campaign in Italy would prove long and grueling, as the Germans fought stubbornly up the mountainous peninsula, delaying the Allies at every turn. Rome was not liberated until June 1944, and the fighting in northern Italy dragged on until the final days of the war. While the Mediterranean theater consumed Allied resources, the main weight of the war still rested on the Eastern Front. After the failure to take Moscow in 1941, Hitler turned his attention to the south, launching a massive summer offensive in 1942, aimed at seizing the oil fields of the Caucasus. But the campaign became bogged down in the city of Stalingrad, on the banks of the Volga River. There, from the summer of 1942 through the bitter winter that followed, German and Soviet troops fought house by house, street by street, in one of the most ferocious battles in history. The city became a symbol of Soviet resistance, and Stalin decreed that not a single step back was to be taken. In November 1942, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive, encircling the German Sixth Army within the ruins of Stalingrad. Hitler ordered them to fight to the last man, refusing to allow a breakout or retreat. For weeks, the trapped soldiers endured starvation and freezing conditions, cut off from supplies. In February 1943, the remnants of the once proud Sixth Army surrendered. Nearly 300,000 German soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. Stalingrad was a catastrophe for Hitler and a turning point in the war. The following summer, in 1943, Germany launched one last great offensive in the east, aimed at the Kursk salient, a huge bulge in the Soviet lines. The Battle of Kursk became the largest tank battle in history, as thousands of armored vehicles clashed across the Russian steppe. But the Soviets were prepared, with deep defensive belts and overwhelming reserves. The German assault was blunted, and the Red Army soon counterattacked, driving the Wehrmacht into retreat. From then on, the initiative in the east would never again belong to Hitler. The Red Army began a relentless advance westward, pushing the Germans out of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, exacting a terrible price as they reclaimed their homeland. By 1943, the Axis powers were on the defensive in every theater. In the Atlantic, Allied convoys were finally gaining the upper hand against the German U-boats. Improved tactics, long-range patrol aircraft, radar, and escort carriers reduced the terrible losses of earlier years. The Battle of the Atlantic, once so precarious, was now turning in the Allies' favor, ensuring that supplies and troops could flow across the ocean to Britain. At the same time, the Allies stepped up their strategic bombing campaigns against Germany. British bombers under Arthur Harris carried out massive night raids, while American B-17 flying fortresses struck by day, aiming to cripple German industry and morale. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Dresden suffered devastating attacks, with tens of thousands killed and entire districts reduced to rubble. Yet German resistance continued, even as the destruction mounted. Through 1943 and into 1944, the Allies prepared for the next great step, the invasion of Western Europe. The task was daunting. The Germans had fortified the Atlantic Wall, a line of defenses stretching from Norway to the French coast, bristling with bunkers, mines, and artillery. Yet the Allies knew that only by opening a second front in France could they relieve pressure on the Soviets and begin the final drive to Berlin. As 1944 dawned, the world was already weary of conflict, yet the war showed no signs of easing. The Axis powers, though battered on many fronts, still held vast territories, and the task of liberating them seemed almost endless. The Allied High Command in London and Washington understood that a decisive blow must be struck, not in Italy or the distant Pacific Islands, but on the shores of Western Europe itself. The Soviet Union had been calling for such a move since 1942, urging Britain and America to open a second front and relieve the immense pressure on the Red Army. Now, with resources growing, ships crossing the Atlantic in great numbers, and American factories turning out planes, tanks, and munitions at an almost unimaginable rate, the time was drawing near when that second front could at last be opened. In the months leading up to summer, the Allies assembled the greatest invasion force the world had ever seen. Across the quiet towns and villages of southern England, fields filled with rows of Sherman tanks, jeeps, and trucks. Airfields overflowed with squadrons of fighters and bombers. Camps brimmed with soldiers from many nations: British, American, Canadian, Free French, Polish, and more, all preparing for a task they knew would be perilous. Sailors aboard warships rehearsed landing operations, while engineers built artificial harbors and special landing craft designed to put men and machines ashore on hostile beaches. Everything was planned with painstaking detail, for the Germans had not been idle. Along the French coast, stretching from Norway down to the Bay of Biscay, Hitler had ordered the construction of what he called the Atlantic Wall, a formidable series of bunkers, gun emplacements, minefields, and beach obstacles designed to repel any invasion. The Allies also prepared an elaborate deception campaign known as Operation Bodyguard to mislead adeptums, the Germans, about where the blow would fall. False radio traffic suggested an invasion of Norway. Inflatable tanks and dummy landing craft were set up in southeast England to make it appear as if the target would be the Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing point across the English Channel. Even the German High Command was deceived by these ruses, keeping valuable armored divisions far from the true invasion beaches. As June approached, the soldiers waited anxiously. The invasion, codenamed Operation Overlord, depended on favorable weather and tides. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, bore the weight of an almost unimaginable decision. On the evening of June 5, 1944, after a brief delay due to storms, Eisenhower gave the order. The Great Armada, more than 5,000 ships of every kind, from mighty battleships to tiny landing craft, began to move across the Channel. Above them, thousands of aircraft roared into the sky, carrying paratroopers and gliders that would descend behind enemy lines in the dark hours before dawn. The morning of June 6, forever remembered as D-Day, brought scenes both heroic and tragic. Along 5 beaches in Normandy, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, waves of landing craft approached the shore under a hail of machine gun fire and artillery shells. At Omaha Beach, the Americans faced some of the heaviest defenses, and for long hours the outcome hung in the balance. Men were cut down as they waded through the surf or scrambled across open sand. Yet slowly, through sheer determination and sacrifice, footholds were established. Engineers cleared obstacles, tanks lumbered ashore, and infantry pressed inland. By the end of that day, over 150,000 Allied troops had landed in France, at a cost of thousands of lives. It was the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. For the German defenders, D-Day was a nightmare realized. Their commanders had long known an invasion was inevitable, but Hitler remained, convinced it would come at Calais. Even as reports flooded in of heavy fighting in Normandy, he hesitated, refusing to release armored reserves until it was too late. The Allies, meanwhile, poured reinforcements across the beaches. Within weeks, a vast supply system had been established, including the ingenious Mulberry harbors, floating docks, and roadways, built in Britain and towed across the Channel, which allowed the unloading of tanks, trucks, and supplies on an industrial scale. The battle for Normandy was far from easy. The French countryside, with its hedgerows and narrow lanes, became a deadly maze where German defenders could hide tanks and machine guns. Fighting was intense and casualties high, especially among American forces around the town of Saint-Lô and British and Canadian troops struggling to capture Caen. Yet the Allies had overwhelming air power, and their bombers pounded German positions relentlessly. By late July, Operation Cobra, a massive breakout spearheaded by American forces, shattered the German lines. Armored divisions surged forward, encircling large numbers of German troops in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. Tens of thousands were killed or captured, and the road to Paris lay open. On August 25, 1944, Allied forces entered the French capital to scenes of jubilation. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags and showering the liberators with flowers. General Charles de Gaulle marched triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées, proclaiming that Paris had been freed by its own people with the support of the Allies. Yet even in victory, the shadow of destruction loomed, for the retreating Germans left devastation in their wake, and across much of France, bitter memories of occupation and collaboration lingered. As the Allies advanced eastward, they faced the formidable Rhine River and the fortified German frontier. Hitler, enraged by the collapse in France, ordered his generals to stand and fight, convinced that the Allies could yet be repelled. In September 1944, the Allies launched Operation Market Garden, a bold attempt to seize bridges in the Netherlands with airborne troops and open a path into Germany's industrial heartland. For a moment, it seemed success was within reach, but fierce German resistance, logistical difficulties, and poor coordination turned the gamble into failure. Arnhem, the last bridge, could not be held, and thousands of paratroopers were lost. The war, it was clear, would not be over by Christmas. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviet juggernaut continued its relentless advance. Operation Bagration, launched in June 1944, had smashed the German Army Group Center, inflicting colossal losses. The Red Army swept through Belarus, recaptured much of Poland, and pushed toward the borders of Germany itself. Stalin's forces were now within striking distance of Warsaw, yet when the Polish Home Army rose in revolt against the Germans that summer, hoping for Soviet support, the Red Army halted its advance. For 63 agonizing days, the Poles fought alone, until the uprising was crushed with appalling brutality. The city was left in ruins, its population decimated, while Stalin coolly prepared to install a communist regime in Poland once the war ended. As autumn turned to winter, Hitler prepared one last desperate gamble. Believing that the Western Allies were complacent after their victories in France, he gathered his remaining reserves for a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, the same forested region his armies had used to great effect in 1940. In December 1944, German tanks and infantry surged forward in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. For several weeks, bitter fighting raged in snow-covered forests and villages. American troops, outnumbered and caught by surprise, fought desperate defensive battles, most famously at Bastogne, where encircled paratroopers of the 101st Airborne held out under siege until relieved by General Patton's Third Army. The weather finally cleared, allowing Allied air power to strike, and the German offensive was driven back with heavy losses. The gamble had failed, and Germany's last reserves of manpower and equipment were spent. By early 1945, the Allies were converging on Germany from east and west. In the east, the Soviets launched their final offensives, smashing through German lines and advancing toward Berlin. In the west, American, British, and Canadian troops crossed the Rhine and swept into the heart of Germany. Cities lay in ruins from relentless bombing, and civilians fled in desperate columns, seeking safety from the advancing armies. The once mighty Reich was collapsing. As 1945 opened, the war entered its final and most terrible phase. Across Europe, entire nations lay scarred and exhausted, their cities in ruins, their fields burned, and their people weary from years of deprivation and fear. Yet the conflict raged on, with greater intensity than ever, for though Germany's fate was sealed, Hitler refused to surrender. He clung to power in Berlin, issuing frantic orders to generals who no longer had the men, the weapons, or the fuel to carry them out. In his mind, there was still hope for a miracle, some new weapon, some split among the Allies, some sudden reversal that might save his collapsing Reich. But outside the walls of his bunker, the reality was grim. Allied armies were closing in from both east and west, and the war that he had unleashed was drawing to its inevitable conclusion. On the Western Front, American, British, and Canadian forces pushed steadily across the German frontier. The great natural barrier of the Rhine River was breached, with daring assaults supported by pontoon bridges and amphibious vehicles. Town after town fell as the Allies advanced, though everywhere they were met with destruction. Bridges were blown up, factories were gutted, and railways were twisted into heaps of iron by retreating German troops, determined to leave nothing of value behind. Yet the sheer weight of Allied power was unstoppable. Columns of Sherman tanks rolled forward, supply convoys stretched for miles, and Allied air forces ruled the skies, strafing and bombing at will. German resistance, though fierce in places, was fragmented and hopeless. In the east, the Soviet juggernaut advanced with terrifying momentum. The Red Army, seasoned by years of brutal fighting, rolled forward in massive waves, their artillery shaking the earth with thunderous barrages, their tanks surging through smoke and fire, their infantry pressing relentlessly on foot. Whole cities were engulfed in flames, as the Soviets liberated territory that had been enslaved by Nazi occupation for nearly 4 years. Yet liberation was often accompanied by vengeance. Hatred burned deep in the hearts of soldiers who had seen their homeland ravaged, their families murdered, their comrades slain. As they advanced into German soil, atrocities multiplied. Civilians fled in panic, desperate to escape the onrushing tide, and ancient towns that had stood for centuries now became battlefields of unimaginable horror. The Allies were now racing toward the same goal, but with very different visions of the future. For the Western powers, led by the United States and Britain, the hope was for a liberated Europe that might rebuild along democratic lines, though the details were uncertain and the scale of destruction was overwhelming. For Stalin and the Soviet Union, the prize was control, the chance to secure his borders with a belt of communist states that would serve as both protection and influence. Thus, as Allied and Soviet armies advanced, a shadow already loomed over the peace that was to come. The seeds of another global rivalry were being sown even before this war had ended. In February 1945, as the armies pushed deeper into Germany, the leaders of the three great allies, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met at Yalta, in the Crimea, to decide the shape of the post-war world. There, amidst the cold palaces and gardens still scarred by war, they discussed the fate of nations. They agreed that Germany would be divided into zones of occupation, that Poland's borders would shift westward, and that free elections would be promised, though Stalin's definition of free was very different from that of his allies. They planned for the creation of a new international organization, the United Nations, to replace the failed League of Nations and preserve peace. Yet beneath the smiles and handshakes lay unease, for trust was already wearing thin, and each leader suspected the others of hidden ambitions. While diplomats debated, the fighting on the ground grew ever more desperate. In the west, American forces crossed the Rhine at Remagen, where a bridge still stood despite German attempts to destroy it. Engineers rushed to reinforce it as soldiers streamed across, securing a bridgehead that hastened the collapse of German defenses. Patton's Third Army surged eastward, capturing towns and sweeping into the industrial Ruhr, where whole German armies surrendered by the tens of thousands. In the north, British and Canadian forces liberated the Netherlands, though famine had struck the Dutch population with cruel force in the winter of 1944-45, and many civilians perished, even as freedom approached. Everywhere, Allied soldiers confronted the harsh realities of war. Villages reduced to rubble, families broken, refugees wandering roads with only what they could carry, and children staring silently at the foreign troops who brought both liberation and the reminder of what had been lost. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army surged toward Berlin itself. By April, they had crossed the Oder River, only 50 miles from the German capital. Hitler, now a hollow figure of his former self, raged within his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, insisting that phantom divisions would save him, that the Königlich Bindine Red Sex down city would hold, that destiny still favored the Reich. In truth, only shattered remnants of the Wehrmacht and hastily conscripted boys and old men remained to defend the capital. The once mighty Luftwaffe was almost gone, its planes grounded by lack of fuel, its pilots dead or captured. Yet in the ruins of Berlin, Nazi propaganda still proclaimed final victory, even as Soviet artillery shells rained down on the city. The Battle of Berlin was among the most ferocious urban battles in history. Street by street, building by building, Soviet troops advanced through a devastated landscape. Apartment blocks became fortresses, subway tunnels became battlegrounds, and every bridge was fought over with bitter determination. Civilians huddled in basements, listening to the thunder above, unsure whether they would survive another day. Fires consumed entire neighborhoods, and the air was thick with smoke and dust. For many Berliners, the arrival of the Red Army was both a deliverance and a terror, for they had heard tales of what vengeance awaited. Yet there was no stopping the Soviet tide. By the end of April, Soviet forces had surrounded the city. Inside the Führer bunker, Hitler realized the end had come. On April 30th, 1945, he took his own life alongside his companion Eva Braun, leaving his crumbling empire to be carved up by the victors. 2 days later, Berlin surrendered. Across Germany, other garrisons and armies laid down their arms. In the north, German forces surrendered to Field Marshal Montgomery. In the south, they gave themselves up to the Americans. On May 7th, in Reims, France, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender to take effect the following day. In Moscow, the news was celebrated on May 9th, which would forever be remembered in Russia as Victory Day. The war in Europe was finally over. Crowds filled the streets of London, Paris, New York, and countless other cities, cheering, singing, and embracing one another in relief and joy. In Britain, Churchill appeared on the balcony of Whitehall to address the throngs, while in America, President Truman dedicated the victory to the memory of Roosevelt, who had died only weeks earlier, and had not lived to see the triumph he had worked so tirelessly to achieve. Yet, for all the celebrations, the shadow of grief lingered. Millions were dead, millions more displaced, and whole nations reduced to ruins. The war had ended in Europe, but in the Pacific, it still raged on, and the final act was yet to come. Even as the bells of victory rang across Europe in the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific still burned with relentless fury. For the United States and its allies, the struggle against Japan had been long and brutal, fought across vast oceans and remote islands where every mile of progress was bought with blood. Unlike in Europe, there had been no sign of collapse within the Japanese leadership. Though their empire had shrunk, though their navy had been shattered at Midway and again in the Philippine Sea, though their armies had been driven back from Burma and New Guinea, Japan still refused to yield. Its leaders spoke of honor, of death before surrender, of a fight to the last breath, and this philosophy seeped into every battle, making the war one of the most savage ever fought. The strategy of the Allies had been one of steady advance, what American commanders called island hopping. Step by step, they pushed across the Pacific, capturing one stronghold, bypassing another, establishing airfields from which they could launch bombers ever closer to the Japanese homeland. Each island became a fortress, defended to the last man. In places like Tarawa, Peleliu, and Saipan, the Japanese dug into caves and tunnels, waiting in silence for the moment to unleash sudden and deadly counterattacks. The cost for the Americans, Australians, and other Allied troops was staggering, yet still they pressed forward. By early 1945, two great battles lay ahead that would define the closing months of the Pacific War: Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Both were stepping stones, islands close enough to Japan to serve as bases for bombers and staging grounds for invasion. Both were defended with fanatical determination, and both would show the world the terrible price of taking a determined enemy's homeland step by step. In February 1945, American forces landed on the volcanic island of Iwo Jima. Barely 8 square miles in size, it was dominated by Mount Suribachi, a looming cone of black rock from which Japanese artillery could strike across the beaches. Hidden within the mountain and throughout the island were a vast network of tunnels, bunkers, and underground chambers. For weeks before the landing, American battleships and aircraft had bombarded the island, shaking it with fire and steel. Yet when the Marines went ashore on the morning of February 19th, there was an eerie silence. The black volcanic sand clung to their boots, slowing their advance. Then, as they moved inland, the hidden guns opened fire. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery tore into the landing forces, cutting men down where they stood. The battle for Iwo Jima raged for more than a month. Every cave, every tunnel, every bunker had to be cleared by hand. Flamethrowers and explosives were used to flush out defenders who refused to surrender. The iconic moment came when Marines raised the American flag atop Mount Suribachi, a symbol of triumph captured in an image that would endure for generations. Yet the fighting did not end. Thousands more Japanese troops remained hidden, striking with sudden fury before retreating deeper underground. When the battle was finally over, nearly 7,000 Americans had been killed, and over 20,000 wounded. Almost the entire Japanese garrison of 20,000 was dead. The island was secured, but at a price that shook the American high command. No sooner had Iwo Jima been taken than preparations began for the next, even more terrible battle: Okinawa. Unlike Iwo Jima, Okinawa was a large island, home to civilians as well as soldiers. It was the last barrier before Japan itself, only a few hundred miles from the home islands. If captured, it would provide a base for the final assault on Japan. In April 1945, the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War began. American and British forces landed on Okinawa's beaches, supported by an immense fleet of ships. At first, resistance seemed light. The Japanese had chosen not to defend the beaches, but to lure the attackers inland into carefully prepared lines of defense. The battle quickly became a nightmare. For nearly 3 months, fighting raged across the island. Hills and ridges became killing grounds. Rain turned the battlefield into a sea of mud. Civilians, trapped in the crossfire, suffered terribly. Many were forced by Japanese troops to fight or serve as porters. Others were caught in artillery fire or bombings. Some, consumed by fear of what would happen if captured, took their own lives. Above the battlefield, kamikaze planes' suicide pilots hurled themselves against the Allied fleet in waves of desperate attacks, sinking ships and killing thousands of sailors. It was a form of warfare that horrified even hardened veterans, for it showed the depths of Japan's resolve and the cost that would be paid if the Allies attempted an invasion of the home islands. When Okinawa finally fell in June 1945, the toll was staggering. More than 12,000 Americans were dead, with tens of thousands wounded. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers had been killed, along with perhaps as many civilians. The island was in ruins, its people shattered, its fields and towns reduced to rubble. For the American leadership, the message was clear. If this was the cost of taking one island, what would be the cost of invading Japan itself? Estimates ran into the hundreds of thousands of Allied dead, perhaps even millions of Japanese lives lost. It was a prospect so grim that it forced the search for another way to end the war. That other way had been in the making for years. in secret laboratories scattered across the United States and Britain. The Manhattan Project, as it was called, had harnessed the power of the atom, creating a weapon of unimaginable destructive force. By the summer of 1945, 2 bombs had been built and tested, and the American leadership now faced the decision of whether to use them. President Truman, who had taken office after Roosevelt's death in April, believed it was the only means of forcing Japan to surrender without the terrible bloodshed of an invasion. The alternative, he feared, would prolong the war and cost untold lives on both sides. In early August, the decision was carried out. On August 6, 1945, a lone American bomber flew over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. At 8:15 inches the morning, the bomb was released. In an instant, a blinding flash lit the sky, followed by a shockwave that flattened buildings, ignited fires, and consumed the city. Tens of thousands of people died within seconds, and many more in the days that followed from burns and radiation. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, with similar devastation. The scale of destruction was unlike anything the world had ever seen, and its psychological impact was immense. In Tokyo, the Japanese leadership was divided. Some argued for fighting on, clinging to hopes of negotiating better terms. Others recognized the hopelessness of their position. Then came another blow. The Soviet Union, which had remained neutral in the Pacific, declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria, overwhelming its defenses. With enemies closing in from every side and his cities reduced to ashes, Emperor Hirohito broke the deadlock. In a rare intervention, he spoke directly to his government, declaring that Japan must surrender. On August 15, 1945, the suggester. Japanese people heard the voice of their emperor on the radio for the first time. In solemn tones, he announced that the war was over, that Japan would endure the unendurable and accept surrender. Across the world, celebrations erupted. In New York's Times Square, crowds danced and kissed in the streets. In London, church bells rang once again. In Sydney, Paris, Moscow, and countless other cities, people wept with relief, knowing that after 6 years of global conflict, the fighting had finally ceased. Yet even in victory, the world confronted the scale of loss. Over 70 million people had died in the Second World War. Entire nations had been scarred. The Holocaust had revealed the depths of human cruelty. Cities lay in ruins, economies shattered, societies uprooted. And though the war had ended, new tensions were already beginning. The alliance of convenience between the Western powers and the Soviet Union was fracturing, giving way to suspicion, rivalry, and the long, cold war that would dominate the second half of the 20th century. Still, for those who had lived through the darkness of World War II, the end brought a fragile hope. The guns were finally silent. Soldiers returned home, families reunited, and the long task of rebuilding could begin. The war had changed the world forever, reshaping borders, societies, and politics. But it had also left a profound lesson, that the cost of global conflict was too great ever to be risked again. The guns may have fallen silent in the late summer of 1945, but for millions of people across the world, the war's end did not bring an immediate return to peace. Entire cities were unrecognizable, lying in ruins beneath blankets of rubble and twisted steel. In Europe, towns that had stood for centuries were reduced to blackened shells. In Germany, from Hamburg to Dresden, Cologne to Berlin, vast swaths of urban life had been obliterated by years of relentless bombing. Families dug through the wreckage of their Gonigo-Lies, bombingly wreckage of their daft homes, searching for the familiar where little remained. Bridges, factories, and rail lines lay shattered, and without them, food and supplies were scarce. Hunger became a constant companion in many parts of the continent, and the cold of winter only made the suffering worse. In the east, across Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, the scars were even deeper. Whole villages had been burned to the ground during the German retreat, their inhabitants massacred or deported. The land that had once produced grain to feed millions was littered with mines, scorched fields, and unmarked graves. Survivors lived in makeshift shelters, their lives a daily battle against starvation and disease. In Asia, the devastation was equally severe. Japanese cities bore the marks of both conventional and atomic warfare. Tokyo, flattened by firebombing earlier in the war, was a charred landscape of ashes and broken chimneys, while Hiroshima and Nagasaki stood as haunting monuments to a new kind of destruction humanity had never seen before. In China, years of brutal occupation had left whole regions desolate. Famine stalked the countryside, and millions who had endured occupation by Japanese forces now faced the slow and painful task of rebuilding lives amid ruin. Southeast Asia, from Burma to the Philippines, was marked by jungle battlefields still strewn with wreckage, and local populations who had lived under both colonial and Japanese control were left uncertain of what their futures would hold. For soldiers returning home, the end of the war brought relief, but also challenges that many had not anticipated. Millions had been away for years, some since the very beginning of the conflict. They returned older, hardened by experience, haunted by memories of battle. Many carried physical wounds, missing limbs or damaged lungs, while others bore invisible scars of trauma that few at the time understood. They stepped off trains or ships to embrace loved ones, only to find that the homes and communities they remembered had been transformed. Families had endured rationing, bombing raids, separations, and loss. Children had grown up without fathers, and sometimes without mothers, and now had to reconnect with parents who had become strangers. For some veterans, the peace they longed for proved harder to find than they had ever imagined. The political map of the world was also changing rapidly. In Europe, Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation: American, British, French, and Soviet. Berlin itself was partitioned, though it lay deep within the Soviet-controlled zone. The great powers had agreed to this arrangement during the war, but as the months passed, it became clear that the unity of the Allies was beginning to fracture. The Western powers spoke of democracy and economic recovery, while the Soviet Union sought to secure its borders with friendly regimes. In Eastern Europe, Red Army troops were everywhere, and pro-Soviet governments began to take power in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, and beyond. In the West, this was seen as a creeping tide of communism, while in Moscow it was presented as security against another invasion from the West. Thus, even before the rubble was cleared, the seeds of a new conflict, the Cold War, had been sown. Elsewhere, the world looked to institutions that might prevent such catastrophe from happening again. In San Francisco in the summer of 1945, representatives from 50 nations gathered to create the United Nations, an international body intended to preserve peace, foster cooperation, and defend human rights. It was a vision born from the ashes of the League of Nations, which had failed to prevent World War II. The UN's charter promised a world where disputes could be resolved through diplomacy rather than arms. For people weary of war, it was a fragile but necessary hope. At the same time, the Nuremberg trials began in Germany, where leading Nazi officials were charged with crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression. For the first time in history, leaders of a defeated nation were held accountable in an international court. The grim details of the Holocaust were laid bare, with survivors testifying about ghettos, death camps, and systematic extermination. Photographs and films shocked the world, leaving no doubt about the horrors that had been committed. The trials established principles that would echo through history, that leaders could not hide behind orders, and that there would be justice, however incomplete, for the victims of atrocities. In Asia, Japan too was placed under occupation, led by American General Douglas MacArthur. For the first time in its history, the Japanese home islands were under foreign control. The once mighty empire was disarmed, its colonies stripped away, and its leaders confronted with the consequences of their militarism. Emperor Hirohito remained, but his divine status was renounced, and a new constitution transformed Japan into a democracy with guarantees of civil rights. Land reforms redistributed property, industries were rebuilt, and slowly, Japan began its astonishing transformation from a militarist empire into a peaceful economic power. Yet in the immediate post-war years, the Japanese people endured severe hardship. Food shortages, homelessness, and the lingering effects of the bombings created an atmosphere of despair. In the shadows of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors lived with radiation sickness, the long-term effects only beginning to be understood. At the same time, colonial empires that had dominated much of the world for centuries began to crumble. The war had drained Britain, France, and the Netherlands of resources and prestige. In India, nationalist movements that had grown during the war now surged forward, demanding independence. In Southeast Asia, where local populations had experienced Japanese occupation, there was no going back to the old colonial order. In Indonesia, Vietnam, and elsewhere, wars of independence erupted. The Second World War had not only redrawn borders but unleashed a wave of decolonization that would transform the global order in the decades to come. Yet the most lasting change may have been in the hearts of ordinary people. For those who had lived through the war, whether in the bombed-out streets of London, the occupied cities of Europe, the frozen wastes of Russia, the jungles of the Pacific, or the deserts of North Africa, life would never be the same. The memories of loss, of fear, of courage, and of survival were etched into their minds. Families carried the absence of those who never came home. Cemeteries across the world filled with young men and women whose lives had been cut short. And in the silence of rebuilt towns and villages, whispers of the past lingered, a reminder of how fragile peace could be. The war had been the greatest and most terrible conflict in human history. It had begun with invasions and dictators, had swept across continents, consumed oceans, and reached into the skies. It had seen the rise of unimaginable cruelty and the endurance of extraordinary courage. It had ended with new weapons of almost apocalyptic power and had left the world forever changed. Out of its destruction came both hope and fear. Hope that the lessons of sacrifice and unity might prevent another such disaster, and fear that humanity's capacity for violence, now magnified by atomic fire, might one day return with even greater fury. As the world stumbled into the second half of the 20th century, the story of World War II remained ever present. Veterans told their stories to children and grandchildren. Writers, filmmakers, and historians sought to capture its scale, its meaning, its contradictions. It became at once a warning and a touchstone, a reminder of what had been endured, what had been lost, and what had been gained. It was, and remains, a testament to both the darkness and resilience of humanity. And for those who drifted into sleep while hearing its story, the echoes of marching armies, the roar of engines, the crack of rifles, and the silence after victory carried with them the weight of history, a history that shaped the modern world and which must never be forgotten. In the uneasy calm that followed the end of the war, the world entered a period of both relief and unease, as if humanity itself was pausing to catch its breath after years of ceaseless violence. The vast armies that had once clashed across Europe and Asia were gradually demobilized, soldiers returning to towns and villages that no longer looked or felt the same. In the United States, millions of servicemen returned under the GI Bill, a program designed to help them reintegrate by offering education, housing loans, and support for new beginnings. Universities swelled with students who had once fought in trenches, on beaches, or in the skies. Suburbs began to expand across the American landscape, filled with modest homes where young families hoped for normalcy after so many years of fear and separation. Yet beneath this image of prosperity lay the lingering shadows of the war. Many veterans carried memories they did not speak of, friends left behind on distant battlefields, sleepless nights haunted by the thunder of artillery, and the sight of destruction that had seared itself into their minds. For some, their wounds were visible crutches, empty sleeves, or wheelchairs, while others bore scars, hidden beneath quiet expressions. In Europe, recovery was far more daunting. Cities like Warsaw, reduced to rubble by years of occupation and resistance, had to be rebuilt almost from nothing. In France, the joy of liberation was mixed with painful reckonings. Collaborators were punished, and entire communities tried to reconcile the years of Nazi rule with the ideals of freedom and resistance. In Germany itself, ordinary citizens faced hunger, homelessness, and despair. The nation, that had once seemed unstoppable, was reduced to ruins, its cities flattened, its leadership disgraced before the world. Many German civilians lived in bombed-out cellars, surviving on thin rations, often dependent on relief from the very enemies who had destroyed their homeland. For the children wandering through streets littered with bricks and ash, the memory of the Reich was not one of triumph, but of absence of fathers who never returned from the front, of mothers weeping quietly, of hunger gnawing at their stomachs as they looked for scraps among the ruins. Across the world, echoes of the war reverberated in ways both subtle and profound. In the Soviet Union, victory had come at unimaginable cost. Entire generations had been thinned out by the conflict, villages emptied of young men, and cities scarred by relentless fighting. Yet in Moscow, the war was remembered as a triumph of sacrifice and resilience. Stalin, secure in his position, used the victory to cement his grip on power. Grand parades marched through Red Square, showing off tanks and banners, as though to remind the world that the Soviet Union was now a superpower, a force to be reckoned with. But away from the parades, millions of families were grieving. The memory of starvation during sieges, of mass executions, and of lives disrupted never far from their thoughts. Fields still littered with mines could not be tilled, and bombed factories were slow to resume production. For ordinary Soviet citizens, the promise of peace often felt like a continuation of hardship by other means. Meanwhile, in Asia, the collapse of Japan's empire unleashed a tide of change that spread rapidly. In China, years of brutal occupation had weakened the country, but it had also hardened divisions between the nationalist government and the growing communist movement under Mao Zedong. Both had fought against the Japanese, but now they turned against each other in a renewed civil war that would shape the future of Asia for decades to come. In India, the end of the war accelerated calls for independence. The Indian National Army, inspired during the conflict, had shown that many were ready to break away from British rule. Protests surged, and by 1947, Britain, exhausted and bankrupt, would finally withdraw, leaving behind a partitioned land, its independence marred by violence. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed freedom from French colonial control, while in Indonesia, nationalist leaders declared independence from Dutch rule. What had begun as a world war against fascism had set in motion a new era of struggles for self-determination, as peoples long under colonial domination seized their moment in the wake of European weakness. At the same time, the shadow of new technology cast itself across every continent. The atomic bombs that had obliterated Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not only weapons of war, they were symbols of a new reality. The mushroom clouds that had risen over Japan were burned into global memory, proof that humanity had unlocked forces capable of destroying entire cities in a flash. In laboratories across the United States and the Soviet Union, scientists who had once been united by war now raced to outdo one another. The nuclear arms race had begun almost as soon as the Second World War had ended, and while the world longed for peace, a new tension gripped the globe. Children practiced duck and cover drills, and ordinary citizens learned the geography of potential targets. Even as cities were rebuilt, the possibility of their annihilation loomed closer than ever before. For survivors of the Holocaust, the end of the war marked not relief but a new beginning filled with uncertainty. Millions of displaced persons wandered across Europe, many with no homes to return to, their families gone, their towns emptied. Camps that had once imprisoned them now became holding places for refugees. Some sought to rebuild lives in Europe, while others dreamed of starting anew in Palestine or the United States. Stories of what they had endured, slowly spread across the world, shocking those who had not believed the rumors of extermination. Photographs of skeletal survivors, of liberated camps with heaps of shoes and eyeglasses, forced the world to confront the depths of cruelty that had been unleashed. In time, this tragedy would give rise to movements for human rights, for remembrance, and for the establishment of a homeland where Jews could seek safety, leading to the eventual creation of Israel. But in those first post-war years, the survivors lived in limbo, struggling each day to reclaim some sense of humanity after so much had been stripped away. As months turned into years, the memory of World War II began to shape not only politics, but also culture. Books, films, and stories emerged that sought to capture its scale, its heroism, and its horrors. For those who had lived through it, the retelling was a way of making sense of an experience that seemed too vast to grasp. For younger generations, it became the defining story of the age, a narrative of sacrifice and endurance that carried lessons for the future. Across countries, monuments were raised, cemeteries carefully tended, anniversaries solemnly observed. The war was over, but it was never truly gone, and its presence lingered in the silence between parents and children, in the scars on landscapes, in the lines on weary faces, and in the fragile hope that such destruction would never be repeated. In the immediate years after the war, the fragile balance of peace quickly gave way to a new and uneasy rivalry between the very powers that had once been allies. The Soviet Union, proud of its victory and its immense sacrifices, saw itself as the liberator of Eastern Europe and moved to ensure that those territories would remain within its influence. Red Army troops did not simply march out once the fighting had stopped. They remained, their presence a daily reminder that liberation had come at a cost, and that Moscow intended to shape the post-war order to its advantage. In Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and later Czechoslovakia, communist parties, sometimes weak before the war, now grew under Soviet sponsorship. Elections, where they were permitted, often carried an air of inevitability, with outcomes heavily influenced by pressure, intimidation, or outright fraud. Local leaders who resisted were quietly removed, while loyal figures to Moscow were elevated. By 1948, the Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill described it, had descended across the continent, dividing Europe into two spheres of influence, one under American and Western European liberal democracies, and the other bound tightly to Stalin's Soviet system. For ordinary citizens of Eastern Europe, the years that followed brought both relief and hardship. The nightmare of Nazi occupation was gone, but it was replaced by new restrictions, new authorities, and new expectations. Farmers were asked to join collective farms, industries were reorganized along socialist lines, and dissent was met with suspicion. The memories of war executions in village squares, starvation, resistance fighters shot in forests, were still fresh, yet they were now reshaped into official narratives, glorifying the Soviet role. Statues of Stalin rose in city centers, red banners fluttered over government buildings, and schoolchildren were taught that the Soviet Union had been their savior, the beacon of a brighter socialist future. But whispers of resentment persisted, passed quietly among families, remembering that the same Soviet troops who had driven out the Germans sometimes took liberties, seizing food or treating locals harshly. It was peace, but it was not freedom. In Western Europe, the story unfolded differently. France and Italy had strong communist movements of their own, bolstered by wartime resistance against the Nazis, but they faced counterweight in the form of American influence. The United States, eager to prevent the spread of Soviet power, introduced the Marshall Plan in 1947, a vast program of economic aid designed to rebuild European industry, restore prosperity, and ensure that desperation would not drive nations into the Soviet camp. Billions of dollars flowed into shattered economies. Cities like Rotterdam, flattened by bombs, began to rise again with modern buildings and new ports. In West Germany, where ruins still stretched for miles, factories were rebuilt with American funds, and within a decade, the country would be producing steel, automobiles, and goods in astonishing quantities. Its recovery so rapid, it came to be called the Wirtschafts wonder, or economic miracle. Yet for many families, the pain of loss lingered. At dinner tables in Paris, Warsaw, Rome, and Berlin, conversations often paused when memories of wartime days arose, for nearly every household carried its own story of absence, grief, or endurance. Beyond Europe, the consequences of the war rippled outward into every corner of the world. The old colonial empires, weakened by 6 years of conflict, could no longer hold their possessions with the same authority. In Africa, movements for independence began to grow, inspired by promises of freedom that Europeans had themselves invoked during the war. Veterans who had fought in Europe returned to their homelands with new confidence, unwilling to accept subjugation after risking their lives abroad. In Asia, the process was faster and fiercer. India's independence in 1947 signaled the beginning of a cascade of change, with Pakistan carved out in bloodshed, and millions displaced in one of the largest migrations in history. In Southeast Asia, nationalist fighters clashed with returning colonial powers. French forces battled in Vietnam, Dutch troops in Indonesia, and the British in Malaya. The war had not ended global conflict. It had merely transformed it, replacing world-spanning battles with struggles of identity, sovereignty, and ideology. Meanwhile, in the United States, a profound transformation was underway. The war had ended the Great Depression, and American industry, geared to produce tanks and aircraft, now shifted to consumer goods. Automobiles, refrigerators, and radios rolled off assembly lines, and soon televisions began appearing in living rooms, bringing moving images of the world into households for the first time. Suburbs expanded across farmland, connected by new highways, filled with families seeking quiet and safety. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity, anxieties stirred. The Cold War had already begun, and with it came a climate of suspicion. Americans who expressed sympathy for socialist ideas, or who had once joined communist movements during the Depression, now found themselves scrutinized. The House Un-American Activities Committee conducted hearings, Hollywood writers were blacklisted, and careers destroyed. The shadow of nuclear weapons, too, loomed large. Every test of a new bomb was front-page news, and families learned of fallout shelters, stockpiling supplies in case of the unthinkable. The comfort of material abundance was offset by the uneasy awareness that at any moment a new kind of war could erupt, more devastating than anything yet imagined. In Japan, defeat brought an altogether different transformation. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bore scars that would never heal, their ruins left standing in part as reminders of the power unleashed in August 1945. But under American occupation, the country undertook sweeping reforms. The emperor, once considered divine, renounced his godlike status, and Japan adopted a new constitution that renounced war as a means of settling disputes. Women gained the right to vote, land was redistributed, and education was reformed. Factories rebuilt with American guidance began producing goods not of war, but of peace: cameras, radios, motorcycles, and eventually cars that would conquer global world markets. For the Japanese people, the memory of wartime devastation mingled with the experience of rapid modernization as their nation rose from ashes into a new kind of power, one defined not by conquest but by commerce. Yet memories of firebombed cities, of lost soldiers in distant jungles, and of hunger during the final desperate years never vanished, always lying beneath the polished surface of recovery. For the millions of refugees displaced by the conflict, the years after the war remained a time of wandering and uncertainty. In Europe, vast camps housed Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, Balts, and countless others who could not return to their homes because borders had shifted or regimes had changed. Families searched desperately for missing relatives, scouring lists, visiting offices, clinging to fading photographs. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, created to manage the crisis, struggled with overwhelming numbers. Many would eventually resettle far from home in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, or in the newly founded State of Israel. But the sense of dislocation remained, a reminder that the war had not only destroyed lives but uprooted entire communities, scattering them across the globe like leaves in a storm. As the decade wore on, the cultural memory of the war deepened. In Britain, the Blitz was retold in memoirs and films as a story of endurance and quiet courage, with images of Londoners sheltering in underground stations becoming iconic symbols of defiance. In the United States, Hollywood produced films that dramatized D-Day, the Pacific battles, and the camaraderie of soldiers, blending fact and fiction to shape a narrative of sacrifice and triumph. In the Soviet Union, films and literature glorified the Great Patriotic War, often downplaying the assistance of the Allies while emphasizing the heroism of Soviet soldiers and the suffering of Soviet civilians. Each nation shaped the war into its own story, a mirror reflecting its values, its pain, and its hopes. And yet, beyond the grand narratives, there were countless private memories, of letters folded in pockets, of lullabies sung to children in shelters, of the silence that fell when news of death arrived at the door. The Second World War had ended, but its shadow remained everywhere. It lived in the new alliances and rivalries, in the rubble that still marked European streets, in the quiet eyes of survivors, in the dreams of independence across the world, and in the looming threat of nuclear fire. For those who had endured it, the war was not a distant history. It was a presence that shaped their every decision, their every conversation, their every hope for the generations to come. By 1944 and 1945, as the tide of the war turned decisively against Germany, the Allies prepared for what would be the most ambitious operation of the entire conflict, the liberation of Western Europe. For years, Britain had been an island fortress, enduring bombings, rationing, and isolation, waiting for the moment when it could strike back across the Channel. Now, with the United States fully engaged and producing weapons and equipment on a scale never seen before, that moment arrived. The plan was monumental in its scale. Hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of ships, and an air armada that filled the skies would converge on the beaches of northern France in an operation that carried the codename Overlord. For months before the invasion, Allied planners staged elaborate deceptions, planting false radio messages, leaking misleading intelligence, and even building dummy armies of inflatable tanks to convince the Germans that the attack would come at Calais rather than Normandy. In villages across southern England, fields filled with tents, trucks, and soldiers, their presence hidden as best as possible from curious eyes and German reconnaissance. Farmers saw their hedgerows lined with tanks, fishermen watched the coastline grow, crowded with warships, and civilians were told little of what was to come, though most could sense that something immense was about to happen. When the invasion came on June 6, 1944, the world held its breath. The first wave of paratroopers dropped in the pre-dawn darkness, scattering across the Norman countryside. Some landed in flooded fields and drowned beneath heavy equipment. Others were shot before they could even free themselves from their parachutes. Yet pockets of men banded together, cutting communication lines, capturing bridges, and creating the chaos that would disrupt German reinforcements. As dawn broke, the largest amphibious invasion in history began. At Utah and Omaha beaches, American troops struggled ashore, wading through churning surf under fire. At Omaha, the resistance was ferocious. Machine guns swept the beach, artillery tore through landing craft, and bodies floated in the tide. For hours, it seemed the assault might fail, but small groups of soldiers pushed forward, scaling cliffs, silencing bunkers, and slowly clawing their way inland. To the east, British and Canadian forces stormed Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, facing their own fierce opposition but advancing steadily. By nightfall, despite horrific casualties, the Allies had established a foothold on the continent. The price had been staggering: thousands dead, wounded, or missing. But the door to Europe had been forced open. In the days that followed, the Normandy countryside became a battlefield of hedgerows, small fields bordered by thick walls of earth, and tangled vegetation. German defenders used the terrain skillfully, setting ambushes and forcing the Allies to fight for every inch. Villages were reduced to rubble as artillery pounded them into submission. Civilians huddled in cellars, clutching children, as walls shook and the ground trembled. Yet the Allies pressed forward, bringing to bear their overwhelming resources. Massive bombing raids targeted German positions, columns of Sherman tanks pushed through narrow lanes, and supply ships unloaded a ceaseless flow of ammunition, food, and fuel across improvised ports. The Germans counterattacked fiercely, bringing their feared Tiger tanks into battle, but they were increasingly hampered by shortages of fuel and aircraft. Slowly, the Allies broke out of Normandy, and by late summer, Paris itself was liberated. Crowds filled the streets, waving flags, embracing soldiers, and cheering as tanks rolled past the Eiffel Tower. For the French, years of occupation were finally over, though the scars of collaboration and resistance, of betrayal and reprisal, would take decades to heal. Meanwhile, in the east, the Red Army launched offensives of staggering size, driving deep into German-occupied territory. Entire fronts, stretching for hundreds of miles, erupted in thunderous bombardments as Soviet artillery unleashed torrents of fire. Tank armies surged forward, crushing German defenses and encircling whole divisions. Villages that had suffered under Nazi rule for 3 years now saw the arrival of Soviet troops, sometimes greeted as liberators, sometimes feared as conquerors, for stories of looting and retribution accompanied them. In the summer of 1944, Operation Bagration shattered German Army Group Center, destroying or capturing hundreds of thousands of men. The road to Berlin was opening, and the German military machine, once seemingly unstoppable, was now staggering under the relentless blows of its enemies. As Germany reeled, Hitler retreated further into fantasy, issuing orders divorced from reality. He commanded troops to hold positions long since overrun, sacked generals who urged withdrawals, and placed faith in miracle weapons that never came in sufficient numbers to alter the course of the war. The weapons, rockets and jet aircraft, did appear, terrifying in their speed and power, but too few and too late. The V-2 rockets that fell on London caused death and destruction, but they could not stop the advance of Allied armies. Inside Germany, civilians began to face the full consequences of total war. Cities were bombed night after night, entire neighborhoods reduced to ashes, and families fled westward with carts and bundles, desperate to escape the approaching front lines. Refugees clogged roads, mingling with retreating soldiers, while hunger and fear gnawed at a population that had once cheered Hitler's promises of victory. In December 1944, Germany launched one last, desperate offensive in the Ardennes forest, hoping to split the Allied lines and seize Antwerp. The Battle of the Bulge, as it became known, threw American forces into confusion at first, with bitter winter fighting in snow-covered forests and towns. Bastogne, encircled and besieged, held out under relentless German attacks, supplied only by airdrops. General Patton's Third Army pushed north in a dramatic maneuver, relieving the defenders and turning the tide. After weeks of brutal combat, the German offensive collapsed, leaving the Reich fatally weakened. For many German soldiers, the realization set in that the war could no longer be won, though surrender remained forbidden. As the Allies crossed the Rhine and Soviet forces advanced across Poland, the circle around Berlin tightened. By April 1945, the German capital was under siege. Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night, reducing buildings to rubble and setting whole districts ablaze. Civilians cowered in basements, food ran out, and the once mighty metropolis became a ruin. Hitler, secluded in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, ranted about betrayal and issued orders to phantom armies that no longer existed. Loyal followers drifted away, some attempting escape, others resigning themselves to the end. On April 30th, Hitler took his own life, and within days, the remnants of German command surrendered unconditionally. In the streets of Berlin, red flags flew, and Soviet soldiers posed atop the shattered Reichstag. Across Europe, church bells rang, crowds gathered in celebration, and the long nightmare of war in Europe came to an end. Yet, even as victory was declared in Europe, the war in Asia still raged. American forces advanced island by island across the Pacific, each battle costly and brutal. On Iwo Jima, Marines fought for weeks in volcanic terrain, raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi in a moment captured forever in photographs. At Okinawa, the fighting was even bloodier, with Japanese troops and civilians alike resisting to the end, while waves of kamikaze aircraft slammed into American ships. The prospect of invading Japan itself loomed, with predictions of staggering casualties. It was in this context that the United States chose to use its new weapon, the atomic bomb. Hiroshima was destroyed in an instant, tens of thousands incinerated, with many more dying in the days and weeks that followed. 3 days later, Nagasaki met the same fate. Shocked by the devastation and facing Soviet entry into the war, Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The Second World War, which had consumed continents and claimed tens of millions of lives, was finally over. For survivors, the end brought relief but not peace of mind. Families searched the ruins for loved ones, prisoners returned home to discover whole communities gone, and the displaced wandered roads across Europe and Asia. Victory celebrations were real, yet mingled with grief and exhaustion. The war had changed the world irrevocably, reshaping borders, societies, and the balance of power. From the ashes of destruction arose two superpowers, each armed with weapons capable of ending civilization, staring at one another across a divided globe. The peace of 1945 was not the peace of security, but the uneasy calm before a new and very different kind of struggle. With the guns finally silenced and the smoke of battle beginning to lift, the world awoke in 1945 to a landscape scarred beyond recognition. Entire cities lay in ruins, their skylines reduced to jagged shells of brick and concrete, and the countryside bore the marks of tank tracks, bomb craters, and hastily dug graves. Millions of men, women, and children wandered the roads of Europe and Asia, displaced, uprooted, and searching for homes that in many cases no longer existed. Prisoners of war were released from camps, their bodies thin and wasted, their eyes hollow from years of hunger and toil. Survivors of the concentration camps stumbled back into the light, carrying the unfathomable weight of what they had endured and witnessed. In the East, Soviet soldiers discovered the extermination camps at Majdanek and Auschwitz, where the machinery of mass murder lay exposed: gas chambers, ovens, and mountains of shoes, hair, and personal belongings that testified to the millions who had perished. The world, confronted with this evidence, struggled to comprehend the scale of the atrocity, yet it marked the beginning of a reckoning that would forever alter humanity's conscience. In Germany, the defeat was total and absolute. Once proud cities such as Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg were now fields of rubble, their populations living among ruins, scavenging for food, and fearing what the occupation might bring. The Allies divided the country into zones, each controlled by one of the victorious powers. While American and British troops distributed rations and attempted to restore order, Soviet forces exacted retribution, seizing equipment, dismantling factories, and carrying off anything of value as reparations. The German people, many of whom had once cheered Hitler's triumphs, now faced hunger, homelessness, and the realization that their country had brought devastation upon itself and the world. Across the continent, justice was demanded not only for the leaders who had unleashed war, but also for those who had orchestrated genocide. At Nuremberg, in a courtroom filled with judges, prosecutors, and witnesses, the architects of the Third Reich were placed on trial. For the first time in history, the concept of crimes against humanity was formally recognized, and the world listened as evidence of planned extermination, forced labor, and mass killings was laid bare. Some of the most powerful men of Hitler's regime were sentenced to death, while others received long prison terms. But beyond the verdicts lay a deeper legacy: the principle that no government or individual could hide behind the excuse of orders when committing atrocities. In Asia, the aftermath of Japan's surrender brought its own complexities. American forces occupied the islands, disarming soldiers and dismantling the machinery of war, but also beginning a process of democratization and reform. For the Japanese people, the shock of defeat and the trauma of the atomic bombings were compounded by the sudden disappearance of the old imperial order. Emperor Hirohito, once revered as a living god, now appeared in public in civilian dress, declaring that he was not divine. Cities like Hiroshima and Nagasaki were left with landscapes of ash and twisted steel, their survivors bearing wounds that would last lifetimes. Across the former territories of the Japanese Empire, nationalist movements surged. In Korea, long under Japanese rule, independence was at last achieved, though it soon became clear that it would come at the price of division. In Vietnam and Indonesia, anti-colonial struggles flared, setting the stage for conflicts that would shape the decades to follow. The war had ended, but the struggles unleashed by its destruction had only just begun. The victors, too, faced choices that would shape the new world order. In conferences at Yalta and Potsdam, leaders of the Allied powers carved up territories, set conditions for post-war governments, and debated the future of Europe. Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and later Harry Truman sat across the table from Joseph Stalin, each representing not only nations, but competing visions of the post-war world. Out of these discussions emerged the outlines of a divided Europe. In the West, democracies supported by American aid and protection. In the East, countries under Soviet control, where communist governments took power with Moscow's backing. The Iron Curtain, as Churchill would famously call it, was descending across the continent, marking the beginning of the Cold War. Yet amidst the division, there was also an attempt to create institutions that might prevent another global catastrophe. The United Nations was established in 1945, its charter signed in San Francisco, promising to uphold peace, promote human rights, and provide a forum for international cooperation. While imperfect, it represented the hope that diplomacy might succeed where previous efforts had failed. For ordinary people, however, the challenges of survival were immediate and overwhelming. In France, the Netherlands, Poland, Greece, and countless other countries, homes and farms lay in ruins, factories were destroyed, and transportation networks were shattered. Food shortages were widespread, and in the bitter winter of 1945–46, hunger stalked millions. In Britain, victory had come at the cost of economic exhaustion, and rationing continued well into the post-war years. In the Soviet Union, victory was celebrated with parades and honors, but behind the triumph lay immense suffering, tens of millions dead, entire regions devastated, and a populace weary from years of hardship. In the United States, the war's end brought a different kind of transformation. Unlike Europe, America's homeland had not been devastated, and its factories had churned out weapons, vehicles, and supplies on an unprecedented scale. As soldiers returned home, they were greeted by booming industry, new opportunities, and the beginnings of what would be called the post-war economic miracle. Yet, even here, memories of sacrifice lingered, and the shadow of the atomic bomb raised questions about the future of warfare and the survival of humanity. Slowly, amid ruins and uncertainty, nations began to rebuild. The Marshall Plan, launched by the United States, poured billions of dollars into Europe, fueling reconstruction and helping to stabilize fragile democracies. Cities rose again from rubble, factories resumed production, and railways once more carried goods across the continent. But the scars of the war could not be erased so quickly. Cemeteries filled with row upon row of white crosses, and stars of David testified to the scale of the loss, while countless families mourned in silence for loved ones who would never return. The displaced and the homeless were resettled, but many carried wounds of body and spirit that would never heal. Across the globe, veterans returned with memories of combat that haunted them in quiet moments, while survivors of camps and massacres struggled to find words for experiences beyond comprehension. The war had ended, but its echo lingered in hearts and minds. a constant reminder of the fragility of peace and the consequences of hatred unchecked. In the decades that followed, the memory of the Second World War was preserved in books, films, memorials, and stories passed down from those who had lived through it. For some, it was remembered as a time of heroism and sacrifice, the moment when freedom was defended against tyranny. For others, it was remembered as a time of horror, loss, and unimaginable cruelty. The Holocaust, in particular, became a symbol of the depths to which humanity could sink and of the urgent need to guard against intolerance and prejudice. Each generation that followed looked back upon the war with both pride and sorrow, seeing in its lessons the necessity of vigilance and the hope that such devastation might never be repeated. The Second World War had begun as a clash of empires and ideologies, unleashed by ambition, hatred, and the failures of diplomacy. It ended with the world transformed, its map redrawn, its societies reshaped, and its people marked forever by what they had endured. Out of its ashes rose a new era, an age of superpowers, nuclear weapons, and global alliances. Yet beneath the politics and the power struggles lay the human cost, the soldiers who fought and fell, the civilians who suffered and endured, and the millions whose lives were cut short. Their memory remains, not only in the monuments and history books, but in the stories whispered within families, in the quiet silences at graveyards, and in the enduring hope that the peace won at such cost might one day be preserved. The war that had shaken the earth finally receded into history, but its legacy lingered in every corner of the globe. For some, the end of World War II brought a long-awaited return to family, to homes, and to quiet lives, though forever changed by memories of hardship. For others, there was no return. Entire villages were gone, entire families wiped away, and entire communities had vanished into the smoke of war. The survivors carried their memories forward, sometimes silently, sometimes with trembling voices, speaking of the winter marches, the fear of air raid sirens, the hunger, the grief, and the small flashes of kindness that had kept them alive. Children, who had grown up in bomb shelters or refugee camps, emerged into a new world, scarred by what they had seen, yet determined to build something better. Slowly, countries stitched themselves back together, but always with the shadow of the war cast long upon their paths. In the East, the Soviet Union emerged bloodied but unbroken, a giant among nations, its Red Army having carried the war to Berlin itself. Stalin, hailed at home as the man who had led his people through their darkest trial, now extended his influence across Eastern Europe, planting the seeds of communist regimes that would dominate the region for decades. In the West, the United States assumed a role unlike any it had ever known before, not only as a victorious power, but as a global leader, its economy unmatched, its military powerful, and its culture spreading outward across oceans. Britain and France, though victorious, recognized the limits of their old empires. Colonies began to stir with the hope of independence, and the old world order built on imperial rule began to crumble. In Asia, Japan rebuilt itself under the watchful eye of American occupation, its people embracing new freedoms, even as they grieved for what had been lost. The world was no longer the same. It was smaller, more interconnected, and more fragile. The advent of nuclear weapons marked a line that humanity could never uncross. In the skies over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, two flashes of light had changed warfare forever, demonstrating both the terrifying power of science and the peril of human ambition. From that moment forward, nations lived with the knowledge that destruction on a scale greater than anything witnessed in the war could be unleashed in an instant. The Cold War soon took shape, with the United States and the Soviet Union locked in rivalry, their nuclear arsenals casting a silent shadow over the planet. Yet, despite the tension, the devastation of World War II remained a warning that prevented both sides from crossing certain lines. The world, once divided by trenches and tanks, now entered an uneasy peace shaped by ideology, technology, and the ever-present memory of the conflict that had preceded it. For the millions who had lived through the war, the passing years brought both healing and remembrance. Veterans gathered at reunions, their numbers dwindling as time carried them onward, but their stories preserved by families, museums, and memorials. Survivors of the Holocaust bore witness, often with great difficulty, to the horrors they had endured, ensuring that the world could not claim ignorance again. In towns and cities across Europe and Asia, monuments rose to honor the fallen silent stone guardians that spoke of sacrifice and loss. In classrooms, children studied the war not as a distant legend, but as a living memory, urged to learn its lessons so that they might never repeat its mistakes. The quiet dignity of remembrance became a thread running through the decades, binding the living to the dead in a shared commitment to peace. Yet the war's echoes were not only solemn, they also inspired hope. Out of the ashes, new ideas took root. The belief that nations could cooperate to prevent conflict, the conviction that human rights must be universal, and the determination to rebuild a better world for the generations to come. The European project, which would later become the European Union, was conceived in the desire to ensure that neighbors who had fought so bitterly might instead trade, share, and prosper together. International courts, conventions, and treaties slowly built a framework of accountability, fragile though it was. Across continents, the war's lessons guided leaders, activists, and ordinary people in their struggles for justice and equality. Even as new conflicts arose in the years that followed, the memory of World War II remained a compass, a reminder of the price of hatred and the power of unity. As the 20th century unfolded, the men and women who had lived through the war aged and passed away, but their voices endured in recordings, books, and family stories. The images of the war, the Normandy landings, the raising of flags, the liberation of camps, the mushroom clouds became etched into the collective consciousness of humanity. They served as both warnings and symbols of resilience, cautioning against pride and violence while celebrating courage and endurance. Each anniversary, each gathering at Normandy's beaches or at Hiroshima's peace ceremonies became a moment to pause, to look back, and to whisper a quiet promise: never again. The war had been vast, complex, and terrible beyond words, but from its wreckage came the chance to begin again, to choose peace over conflict, compassion over cruelty, and hope over despair. In the stillness of the present, as night falls and stories of the past are told in hushed tones, the Second World War feels both distant and immediate. Distant, because the world has changed beyond recognition since those days of marching armies and roaring aircraft. Immediate, because the lessons remain urgent, the memories vivid, and the consequences still shaping the lives of billions. To listen to its story is to walk through the corridors of history, lit by both darkness and light, filled with the voices of the lost and the enduring heartbeat of the living. It is a story of tragedy and triumph, of cruelty and kindness, of despair and resilience. It is the story of humanity itself, fallible, fragile, yet capable of endurance and renewal. And so, as we close the long tale of the Second World War, let us carry its memory with gentleness. Let us honor the millions who perished, the millions who fought, and the millions who endured. Let us remember that even in the darkest of times, humanity has found ways to endure, to resist, and to hope. And as sleep slowly gathers, wrapping these stories in the quiet of night, may the echoes of history remind us not of war alone, but of the peace that followed, and the fragile, precious duty of preserving it. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world was left standing amidst ruins, both visible and invisible. Entire cities had been reduced to ashes, bridges and railways lay twisted and broken, and once fertile farmlands were scarred by shell craters and tank tracks. Yet even more profound than the shattered landscapes were the wounds carved into the hearts of millions who had endured the long darkness of war. From London to Leningrad, from Hiroshima to Hamburg, from the deserts of North Africa to the islands of the Pacific, the conflict had left no corner of underdefinitely humanity untouched. For soldiers returning home, the silence after years of gunfire was almost unbearable. Men who had once marched together across muddy fields and smoking ruins now found themselves on trains, bound for familiar towns that felt strangely unfamiliar. A young British soldier, having survived the Normandy beaches and the winter in the Ardennes, stepped off at a small station in Yorkshire, greeted by his mother and younger sister. They embraced him tightly, but behind their smiles was a quiet recognition that he was not the same boy who had left in 1940. His eyes carried memories he would never fully share. In France, farmers plowed fields where burned-out tanks still rusted, sometimes unearthing helmets, rifles, or even bones as their plows cut through the soil. The war remained in the earth itself, whispering reminders of all that had been lost. In the cities, survivors began to rebuild brick by brick. In Warsaw, more than 85% of the city had been destroyed, but people returned with shovels, carts, and bare hands. They salvaged what they could from the rubble, clearing streets so children could once again walk to improvised schools. Women who had spent years resisting in the shadows now carried stones and laid foundations. In Berlin, families lived in the ruins of apartment blocks, cooking meals over makeshift stoves fueled by scavenged wood. In Tokyo, where entire neighborhoods had been consumed by firebombing, the air was heavy with the smell of charred wood long after the flames had gone. Yet amid the ashes, the first green shoots of determination began to appear. Governments, too, sought ways to heal nations fractured by years of conflict. In the West, the United States unveiled the Marshall Plan, pouring billions into rebuilding Europe. Trainloads of food, machinery, and raw materials crossed the Atlantic, destined for hungry families and shattered factories. In France, new bakeries opened with American flour. In West Germany, workshops hummed with life once more, forging steel and shaping tools for reconstruction. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, having borne the heaviest toll of all with more than 20 million dead, tightened its grip over Eastern Europe. In Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and beyond, Soviet influence spread like a shadow, promising security but demanding obedience. Thus the seeds of a new rivalry were sown, one that would divide the world into East and West for decades to come. But history is never just about governments and treaties. It is also about small, fragile acts of survival. A Jewish survivor of Auschwitz, liberated by advancing Soviet troops, stood on a platform in Krakow, clutching the hand of a girl who was not his daughter but whom he had promised her dying mother he would protect. They had nowhere to go, no home to return to, but they had each other. In the Philippines, a farmer returned to his land after years of Japanese occupation, only to find his rice paddies overgrown with weeds. Slowly, he bent his back once more to the earth, determined to coax food from the soil. In London, children who had been evacuated to the countryside returned to their parents after years apart, meeting fathers who were strangers to them and mothers who had grown older under the strain of war. In Asia, the end of the conflict brought not only relief, but profound transformation. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had ended the war with Japan, but at a cost too heavy to fathom. In Hiroshima, shadows of people burned into stone walls remained, haunting reminders of the morning when the sky itself had turned to fire. Survivors, known as hibakusha, struggled not only with illness but with memories that defied description. Yet they, too, rebuilt. In the ruins, children's laughter slowly returned as new schools rose from the ashes and small businesses reopened, selling rice balls and fish once again. Across Asia, the collapse of European colonial powers ignited movements for independence. In India, long ruled by Britain, the dream of freedom was now within reach. Across Indonesia, Vietnam, and Africa, voices that had been silenced began to speak more boldly, demanding nations of their own. The creation of the United Nations in 1945 symbolized a yearning for a new order, one in which the horrors of global war would never be repeated. Representatives gathered in San Francisco to draft a charter, vowing to protect human rights and resolve disputes peacefully. For those who had lost so much, it was a fragile hope, but it was something to cling to. The Nuremberg trials, held in Germany, brought leading Nazi officials before judges to answer for crimes against humanity. For the first time in history, the world declared that even leaders were not above the law. Survivors of concentration camps testified to unimaginable cruelty, their trembling voices piercing courtrooms that had once echoed with authority and power. Justice was imperfect, and not all perpetrators were punished, but it marked a beginning. Still, for ordinary people, justice was often found not in courtrooms, but in the act of carrying on. A widow in Stalingrad planted flowers in the rubble where her husband had died, a small defiance against the enormity of loss. A German boy shared bread with an American soldier stationed in his town, bridging a gap that politics had torn wide open. A Japanese schoolteacher gathered children in a bombed-out classroom, teaching them to write letters once more, reminding them that knowledge and language could survive, even when buildings could not. The war had shown humanity its darkest face, but it had also revealed unexpected lights of compassion. Prisoners in labor camps who had shared scraps of food, neighbors who had sheltered children not their own, soldiers who had spared civilians when orders told them otherwise. All these small acts stood like stars against a night sky of destruction. They became the threads from which a wounded world began to stitch itself whole again. As the years passed, memories of the war remained etched in every corner of life. Veterans limped on wounded legs, mothers kept faded photographs of sons who had never come home, and children grew up hearing stories told in hushed tones by candlelight. Yet alongside the pain grew new lives. Weddings were celebrated, babies were born, and laughter slowly returned to cafes, marketplaces, and village squares. The world was no longer the same. Borders had shifted, empires had collapsed, and two new superpowers faced each other in a wary standoff. Yet amid all the tension, there was also a lesson learned at terrible cost, that peace, however fragile, was worth protecting. And so, brick by brick, word by word, and act by act, people rebuilt. They carried the memories of those who had fallen, honoring them not only with monuments and ceremonies, but with the simple act of living, of choosing hope over despair. Thus, the war that had begun with thunderous invasions and the roar of aircraft ended not with silence, but with the quiet determination of millions who chose to rise again. They were farmers, sowing seeds in scorched earth, mothers telling bedtime stories in ruined homes, and children daring to dream of futures brighter than the shadows they had inherited. Together, their small, steadfast acts became the true epilogue of the Second World War, a reminder that even after the greatest darkness, humanity can find the strength to begin anew.
In the years immediately following the gun's final silence, the world stood at a crossroads unlike any it had known before. The victors were weary, the defeated were broken, and yet all shared the same challenge: how to live again after so much death. Across the continents, people emerged from air raid shelters, bunkers, refugee camps, and military barracks into a world both familiar and foreign. Streets were lined with rubble, yet birds still sang in the mornings. Rivers still flowed, though their bridges lay shattered. The paradox of life carrying on amid devastation gave many the strength to take their first tentative steps into peace. For Germany, the collapse of the Third Reich was absolute. The once mighty cities of Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden lay in ruins, their skeletal remains a testament to the relentless Allied bombing campaigns. Millions of civilians struggled simply to survive. Food was scarce, clothing worn thin, and entire families were crowded into the basements of bombed-out buildings. Children played with helmets and shell casings, their games echoing the horrors their parents wished they could erase. For the German people, surrender was only the beginning of a new ordeal. Occupied by the Allied powers, the country was divided into zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. At first, this division was meant only as an administrative measure, but soon it began to crystallize into something far more enduring: a line between two worlds, two ideologies, and eventually two futures. In the Soviet zone, control was harsh. Farms and factories were seized, and political opponents disappeared into prisons or labor camps. Soviet soldiers, many hardened by years of unimaginable suffering, exacted both vengeance and authority. Meanwhile, in the western zones, American and British authorities sought to restore a semblance of normal life. They introduced food relief programs, reopened schools, and tried to encourage democratic structures. Yet even here, bitterness lingered. The Nuremberg trials brought Nazi leaders to justice, but they also reminded everyone of the scale of atrocities committed in Europe's heart. Witnesses spoke of ghettos, camps, and gas chambers. Survivors lifted their sleeves to show the tattooed numbers on their arms. The world listened in horror, and many Germans, confronted with evidence they could no longer deny, felt a mix of shame, anger, and grief. At the same time, far to the east, Japan struggled under its own burden of defeat. Tokyo was a scarred landscape of blackened ruins, the imperial palace standing amid miles of devastation. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, still smoldering in memory from the atomic bombs, bore wounds unlike any the world had ever seen. Survivors walked with bandaged limbs and burned faces. Hibakusha, whose very presence told the story of weapons that had altered the nature of warfare forever. Under the occupation led by General Douglas MacArthur, Japan was compelled to adopt sweeping reforms. Its military was dismantled, its political system restructured, and its society reshaped. Women gained the right to vote, democratic institutions were introduced, and the emperor, once considered divine, renounced his godlike status. Yet the resilience of the Japanese people shone through. Within years, they would rebuild their shattered cities into centers of industry and innovation, though the memory of fire and ash would never fully fade. Elsewhere in Asia, the collapse of Japanese power ignited long-suppressed movements for independence. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh declared freedom from colonial rule, though conflict with returning French forces loomed. In Indonesia, Sukarno and nationalist leaders demanded independence from Dutch control. Across India, where the war had stirred both sacrifice and suffering, the call for freedom grew louder. Britain, exhausted and financially strained, could no longer hold its empire together. In 1947, India and Pakistan emerged as independent nations, their birth accompanied by both celebration and violence. The subcontinent was torn by partition, millions displaced, and countless lives lost in communal strife. Still, the end of colonial rule marked a profound turning point, the war having accelerated the twilight of empires. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States stood transformed. Once reluctant to enter the war, it emerged as the most powerful nation on Earth. Its factories, untouched by bombing, had produced weapons and supplies in astonishing numbers. Its cities had grown rather than crumbled. Returning soldiers were greeted with parades, but also with opportunities. The GI Bill offered education, housing, and support, creating a new middle class and fueling dreams of suburban life. Yet beneath the optimism lay challenges. African American veterans who had fought bravely abroad returned to a segregated society determined to claim rights long denied. Women who had worked in factories and offices during the war were often pushed back into domestic roles, but many resisted, planting the seeds of future movements for equality. The Soviet Union, too, emerged from the war as a superpower, though at a terrible cost. Its people had endured starvation, siege, and the loss of entire cities. Yet its armies had marched into Berlin, its flag had been raised over the Reichstag, and its influence now stretched deep into Eastern Europe. Stalin moved quickly to secure this sphere, installing governments loyal to Moscow and ensuring that the Red Army remained an unchallenged presence. To many in the West, this expansion looked less like liberation and more like occupation. Thus, even as the war ended, the Cold War was beginning, a new conflict not fought with tanks and bombs, but with ideology, spies, and nuclear threats. For ordinary people across the globe, however, the immediate concern was simpler: survival. In villages from France to Poland, farmers returned to their land, coaxing crops from soils still littered with shrapnel. In Britain, rationing continued into the late 1940s as shortages of food and fuel persisted. Families shared what little they had, queuing patiently for bread and milk. Children, many of whom had never known peace, finally went back to schools, their classrooms often held in makeshift buildings patched together from war debris. Teachers spoke softly, hoping to restore a sense of normalcy. In America, families gathered around radios, hearing news of rebuilding in Europe and debates about a new international order. In the ruins of Asia and Africa, people looked beyond survival to dreams of independence, their voices rising louder each year. The creation of the United Nations in October 1945 embodied this fragile hope for peace. Representatives of 50 nations gathered to sign its charter, vowing never again to allow the world to descend into such chaos. They spoke of human rights, of cooperation, and of a world bound together not by conquest but by shared responsibility. Yet even in its founding, the divisions of the Cold War were evident. The Security Council, with its permanent members, reflected both the desire for unity and the reality of competing powers. Still, for many survivors, the very idea of nations speaking instead of fighting was a balm to their wounded spirits. Amid these global shifts, personal stories continued to shape the fabric of post-war life. A French family returned to their village near Caen to find their farmhouse destroyed, yet neighbors gathered to help them rebuild, one beam and one stone at a time. In Greece, where civil conflict erupted after liberation, families were torn between rival ideologies, brothers fighting brothers in the shadow of larger powers. In China, the defeat of Japan reignited the struggle between the nationalists and communists, a conflict that would reshape Asia for generations. Everywhere, people longed for peace, but discovered that peace, too, demanded sacrifice, resilience, and patience. The war had changed not only borders and governments, but the very nature of human imagination. In the glow of atomic fire, people understood for the first time that humanity now held the power to destroy itself completely. Fear of this new reality mingled with awe at the scientific breakthroughs of the age. Rockets that had once carried bombs to London would soon carry men to the stars. Radar, born of war, would transform communication and exploration. Antibiotics, mass-produced to save soldiers, would now save countless civilians. The dual legacy of destruction and progress shaped the world in ways both terrifying and inspiring. For veterans, the adjustment to peace was often the hardest battle of all. Men who had lived in the constant rhythm of orders and danger now found themselves standing in quiet streets, unsure of where to go or what to do. Some found solace in building families, in planting gardens, in taking jobs that gave them purpose. Others carried invisible wounds, haunted by memories of comrades lost, by nightmares of battlefields that returned in their sleep. In America, clinics slowly began to recognize what would later be called post-traumatic stress, though for many years it remained misunderstood. In Europe, memorials rose, names carved into stone, but the true weight of grief was borne in private, in the silent tears of widows and the empty chairs at family tables. Children, too, bore the scars. In Germany, young boys and girls who had been indoctrinated into the Hitler Youth struggled to reconcile the lies they had been taught with the reality of their country's defeat. In Japan, children who had lost parents in bombings grew up quickly, helping siblings survive in makeshift shelters. In Britain, children who had been evacuated returned to parents they barely knew, their lives split between countryside calm and urban destruction. Yet these same children would become the generation that carried the memory of war into the future, ensuring that its lessons would not be forgotten. As 1945 turned to 1946 and beyond, the world felt itself on the cusp of something new. Old empires were crumbling, new nations were rising, and the balance of power was shifting dramatically. The map of the world was being redrawn, not by conquerors alone, but by the voices of people demanding change. And though the shadow of nuclear weapons loomed over every decision, there was also a fragile optimism that perhaps humanity, having touched the abyss, might yet learn to step back from it. The Second World War had been a storm of fire and steel, but now, in its wake, the slow work of healing began. It was not dramatic like battles, or decisive like treaties. It was the daily persistence of ordinary people, planting seeds in ruined fields, rebuilding homes from rubble, teaching children in broken schools, singing songs in languages nearly silenced. These small, stubborn acts of life carried within them a quiet defiance against despair, and in that defiance lay the promise of a future, fragile but real, that would grow in the decades to come. By 1946, the dust of war had barely settled, but already new tensions were reshaping the globe. The uneasy alliance that had defeated fascism was beginning to fracture, and where once the world had been united against a common enemy, now suspicion grew between East and West. Soldiers who had marched side by side in Berlin or shared cigarettes in the ruins of Vienna now returned to their nations with mistrust simmering. The war had ended, but its shadow lingered, casting long lines across maps and hearts alike. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union consolidated its hold. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria found themselves firmly within Moscow's orbit. The presence of the Red Army and the political pressure of communist parties ensured that Stalin's vision of a secure buffer zone became reality. From the Baltic to the Balkans, governments were reshaped, opponents silenced, and institutions remade in the Soviet image. Elections, where they were held, were carefully controlled. To many in the West, this seemed less like liberation and more like the substitution of one tyranny for another. But for many Eastern Europeans, exhausted and impoverished, the promise of land reform, education, and industrial growth held a certain appeal, even if it came at the cost of freedom. In the West, the mood was equally complex. France, devastated by occupation and collaboration, struggled with its national identity. The trials of Vichy officials and collaborators opened wounds that would take decades to heal. Charles de Gaulle sought to restore French pride and independence, determined that his country would not be reduced to a pawn between America and Russia. In Britain, victory had come at immense cost. Cities bore the scars of bombing. The economy was drained, and rationing persisted. Winston Churchill, the great war leader, was voted out of office in 1945, replaced by Clement Attlee, whose Labour government promised to build a new society. Out of the ruins, Britain introduced the welfare state, national health care, and sweeping social reforms, determined to reward the sacrifices of its people with a more just future. Across the Atlantic, the United States faced a different reality. It had emerged from the war stronger than ever, its industry booming, its population energized. American soldiers returned to ticker-tape parades and promises of opportunity. Suburbs began to spread, universities filled with veterans using the GI Bill, and consumer culture blossomed. Yet the war had left its mark. Families mourned their dead, veterans wrestled with memories they could not share, and the specter of nuclear war now haunted every newspaper headline. America's leaders understood that their nation had become the center of global power, but with that power came a new responsibility that many were only beginning to comprehend. Meanwhile, in Asia, the collapse of Japanese imperial power opened a Pandora's box of conflict and transformation. Korea, liberated from Japanese rule, was split into two zones of occupation, North and South, each backed by rival superpowers. In China, the uneasy alliance between nationalists and communists collapsed almost immediately into renewed civil war. Mao Zedong's Red Army gained ground against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, fueled by peasant support and the promise of radical change. By the late 1942, the communists would triumph, reshaping Asia's balance of power forever. In Vietnam, nationalist forces who had resisted the Japanese turned their struggle against French colonial rule, sparking a conflict that would drag in outside powers and ignite decades of war. Japan itself underwent one of the most remarkable transformations in history. Under American occupation, the country was demilitarized, democratized, and restructured. Factories once devoted to war production were redirected to consumer goods. Land reforms broke up feudal estates, and a new constitution enshrined the principles of peace and democracy. Women gained new rights, unions flourished, and education was reimagined. The scars of Hiroshima and Nagasaki lingered, etched into memory and flesh, but out of devastation came renewal. Within a generation, Japan would rise as an economic power, a symbol of resilience and adaptation. The Middle East, too, felt the war's aftershocks. The British and French mandates, weakened by years of conflict, faced growing nationalist demands. In Palestine, tensions between Jewish immigrants, many of them Holocaust survivors, and the Arab population escalated toward violence. The dream of a Jewish homeland, given new urgency by the horrors of the camps, clashed with the aspirations of Arab nationalism. The seeds of decades of conflict were being sown, even as the world's attention shifted elsewhere. At the same time, the full horror of the Holocaust began to emerge. Though rumors and reports had circulated during the war, it was only after liberation that the scale became undeniable. Soldiers entering camps like Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and Auschwitz confronted scenes of starvation, disease, and unimaginable cruelty. The world listened as survivors testified to mass shootings, gas chambers, and forced labor. The figure of 6 million murdered Jews shocked the conscience of humanity. Roma people, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and others had also perished, their stories adding to the enormity of the crime. The phrase, "never again," entered the global vocabulary, though its promise would be tested time and again in the decades that followed. As nations wrestled with rebuilding, the old colonial order unraveled. India's independence in 1947 was followed by the partition into India and Pakistan, an event that unleashed both joy and unspeakable tragedy. Millions crossed new borders, Hindus and Sikhs heading one way, Muslims the other, in one of the largest migrations in human history. Violence erupted, villages burned, and countless lives were lost. Yet even amid suffering, the end of empire was undeniable. Across Africa, leaders watched closely, inspired by the possibility that their own liberation was within reach. The creation of Israel in 1948 further reshaped the Middle East. For Jews, it was the realization of a dream long denied, a homeland carved from centuries of exile and persecution. For Palestinians, it was the beginning of displacement, dispossession, and conflict. The birth of one nation was the trauma of another, and the echoes of that moment still resound in our own age. In Europe, the Marshall Plan signaled America's commitment to rebuilding the continent. Billions of dollars flowed into factories, farms, and infrastructure. Cities began to rise from ruins, economies revived, and hope flickered anew. Yet the aid came with strings, binding Western Europe to WW2, America's orbit. The Soviets refused to participate and tightened their grip on the East. The division of Germany hardened, Berlin becoming a microcosm of the larger conflict, a city split between rival visions of the future. It was within this fragile, divided world that the Cold War was born. Iron curtains and atomic arsenals replaced trenches and blitzkriegs, but the fear was just as real. For ordinary people, the war had ended, but peace remained elusive. They carried on, planting fields, rebuilding homes, raising families, even as new uncertainties loomed. And in the quiet moments, when the sirens were silent, and the skies no longer filled with bombers, they reflected on what they had endured. They wondered if the sacrifice had been worth it, if the lessons of the past would truly shape the future, or if humanity was doomed to stumble once more into darkness. The Second World War had redrawn borders, toppled empires, and unleashed technologies that forever altered existence. But perhaps its greatest legacy was the reminder of both the fragility and resilience of the human spirit. In the faces of children playing in the rubble of Warsaw, in the determination of Japanese farmers planting rice in irradiated soil, in the resolve of survivors lighting candles for lost families, one could see not only the pain of the past, but the stubborn insistence that life would go on. That insistence, more than any speech or treaty, was the foundation of the post-war world. And as the 1940 seconds closed and a new decade dawned, the question remained: would the peace hold, or was this merely a pause before another storm? As the war drew to its bloody conclusion in 1945, a hush of exhaustion settled over much of the world. For 6 years, entire societies had been consumed by conflict, their industries bent toward destruction, their fields turned into battlegrounds, and their populations made to endure suffering on a scale never before witnessed. Now, at last, the guns had fallen, silent, and yet the echoes lingered, reverberating through ruined streets, through the memories of veterans, and in the hollow eyes of survivors who walked out of camps and rubble alike. Victory had come, but it was heavy with grief. It was not the triumph of joy but the release of unbearable strain, and it was only the beginning of a new struggle this time, not for dominance on the battlefield, but for survival in a fractured, fragile peace. The war had left the continent scarred. Cities that had once been centers of culture and commerce now stood as ghostly shells. Warsaw was flattened almost entirely, a landscape of broken bricks where streets and homes had once been. Berlin was reduced to a jagged labyrinth of collapsed concrete, with families sheltering in basements, cooking whatever scraps they could find. Dresden, Hamburg, Tokyo, Nagoya, all had been consumed by firestorms, the night skies glowing red as entire neighborhoods vanished in the roar of flames. In France, bridges and railways lay in ruins, painstakingly sabotaged during retreats. In Italy, towns along the Gothic line were scarred by artillery and bombs, and in Greece, famine had devastated the land. Japan bore scars unique in human history, the atomic ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where shadows of people had been burned into walls and survivors carried injuries that would last generations. Amidst this devastation, survivors returned. Soldiers stumbled home from the front, emaciated, weary, often carrying wounds both visible and hidden. Prisoners of war emerged from camps in Siberia, Manchuria, and across Europe, their clothes hanging loose on starved frames. Holocaust survivors, skeletal and traumatized, tried to pick up the fragments of shattered families, often to find none remained. Civilians who had endured occupation returned to ruined homes or discovered strangers living in their apartments. Refugees wandered across borders in numbers so vast that Europe seemed like a continent in constant motion, millions searching for a place to belong. Families were reunited, but many more were left forever incomplete, with loved ones buried in unmarked graves or never found at all. The victors were left with the monumental task of reconstruction. In Europe, the challenge was not merely physical but spiritual. How could societies that had been reduced to rubble find purpose again? For many, the answer was work bricks were laid, roads were rebuilt, and factories were retooled, not for tanks and bombs, but for civilian needs. For others, the answer lay in politics and ideology. The Soviet Union pressed its vision of socialist reconstruction, nationalizing industries and enforcing new social structures, while in the West, leaders turned to democracy and capitalism, backed by American aid. It was in these choices that the seeds of the next global conflict, the Cold War, were sown. In Germany, the task of reckoning was especially immense. The country had been split into 4 zones of occupation: American, British, French, and Soviet. Each occupier imposed its own vision of the future. Denazification trials sought to root out the ideology that had led to catastrophe, though often they were more symbolic than thorough. Millions of Germans, once complicit or at least silent, now claimed ignorance of the crimes committed in their name. The Nuremberg trials attempted to bring high-ranking Nazis to justice, presenting chilling evidence of genocide, aggressive war, and crimes against humanity. For the first time, international law was invoked to judge leaders not just for what they had done to enemies, but for crimes committed against their own people. Yet justice could only go so far. Most Germans were left to grapple quietly with shame, guilt, or denial, while trying to survive amidst scarcity and ruin. In Japan, too, the reckoning came. The Tokyo trials prosecuted leaders responsible for aggression in Asia and atrocities across the Pacific. Emperor Hirohito, however, was spared, preserved as a symbol of continuity under American guidance. General Douglas MacArthur oversaw the occupation, steering reforms that would transform Japan from an imperial aggressor into a pacifist democracy. Land was redistributed, zaibatsu conglomerates were broken apart, and women gained the right to vote. The Constitution renounced war as a tool of statecraft, a radical departure from the militarism that had driven Japan to conquest. But beneath the optimism of reform, scars remained deep. Survivors of firebombings, of forced labor, of atomic radiation, millions carried the burden of war in silence, their stories often unspoken in a culture that prized endurance. The world, too, attempted to create structures to prevent another catastrophe. In 1945, the United Nations was born. Delegates from 50 nations gathered in San Francisco to draft a charter that pledged collective security, human rights, and peaceful resolution of disputes. It was, in many ways, the idealistic child of war, forged from the hope that nations could cooperate to avert future horrors. But even as the ink dried, divisions between East and West were already clear. The Security Council, with its permanent members wielding veto power, embodied both the ambition and the limitations of global governance. It was a world organization built on the cooperation of rivals who trusted each other little. In the United States, the war had transformed society. The Great Depression was a memory, replaced by booming industry and newfound confidence. Yet, there were contradictions. African American soldiers who had fought in Europe and the Pacific returned to Jim Crow segregation, their service honored abroad but ignored at home. Women who had worked in factories were told to return to domestic roles, sparking quiet debates about equality that would grow louder in later decades. Veterans struggled with trauma, what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, but at TBEs, the time was dismissed as battle fatigue or shell shock. For all the celebrations of victory, the war had left invisible scars on countless American families. In the Soviet Union, the cost of victory was almost unimaginable. 27 million dead, entire cities obliterated, farms burned, infrastructure shattered. Yet Stalin presented the triumph as proof of socialism's superiority, parading tanks through Red Square, cementing his grip on power. While citizens rebuilt with extraordinary resilience, they did so under the watchful eye of secret police, censorship, and repression. Victory had not brought freedom, but deeper entrenchment of dictatorship. For many Soviet citizens, the war's end was not the dawn of peace, but the continuation of hardship under a different banner. Colonial empires, meanwhile, found their authority eroded. The war had exposed the vulnerability of European powers and awakened nationalist movements worldwide. In India, the independence movement reached its peak, and by 1947, Britain reluctantly withdrew, partitioning the subcontinent into India and Pakistan. The joy of independence was marred by one of the bloodiest migrations in history, as millions fled across borders amid sectarian violence. In Indonesia, nationalists declared independence from the Dutch, sparking a brutal conflict. Across Africa, activists and veterans who had served in European armies returned home with new demands for freedom, planting seeds that would bloom in the decades ahead. The Holocaust, once revealed in its enormity, reshaped moral consciousness. Survivors who testified to the gas chambers, the shootings, the ghettos, forced the world to confront what had been allowed to happen in silence. Jewish communities, shattered and dispersed, sought safety in new homelands, accelerating the drive toward the creation of Israel. At the same time, the lessons of genocide prompted the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention, fragile attempts to enshrine dignity and protection for all peoples. Yet, the irony was bitter. Even as the world declared never again, new conflicts and atrocities would test humanity's resolve. Science and technology, too, bore the mark of war. The atomic bomb had ended the conflict in the Pacific, but opened a terrifying new era. The image of a mushroom cloud became a symbol of humanity's ability to destroy itself in moments. Scientists who had labored on the Manhattan Project wrestled with guilt and responsibility, their discoveries unleashing forces beyond politics or morality. At the same time, wartime innovations in medicine, aviation, and communication spilled into civilian life, shaping the modern world. Penicillin, radar, jet engines, computers, all products of war that would redefine peace. For ordinary people, though, the focus was on survival and rebuilding. Mothers stitched clothing from scraps, fathers patched roofs with scavenged wood, children played in the ruins with sticks and tin cans. Weddings were held amidst rubble, laughter returned slowly, and life reasserted itself in small, stubborn ways. Farmers tilled fields that had once been battlefields. Musicians played in makeshift halls, their melodies echoing among broken walls. Teachers returned to classrooms, sometimes without books or chalk, determined to teach children who had grown up knowing nothing but war. And yet, beneath the fragile normalcy, unease lingered. The world had seen what humanity was capable of, both the heights of sacrifice and courage and the depths of cruelty and destruction. In taverns, in churches, in homes lit by candles, people spoke in hushed tones about the future. Would peace last? Could nations truly cooperate? Or was this only an interlude before the next storm? The answer would not be long in coming. By 1946 and 1947, tensions between the former Allies hardened into open rivalry. In Eastern Europe, Soviet-backed regimes consolidated power, while in Western Europe, Marshall Plan aid tied nations to the American sphere. In Greece and Turkey, civil wars and unrest drew in foreign powers. In Germany, the blockade of Berlin foreshadowed the division of the continent. The Cold War was beginning, a conflict fought not with tanks in open battlefields, but with spies, propaganda, nuclear arsenals, and proxy wars across the globe. The Second World War had ended, but its shadow stretched long, shaping the second half of the 20th century. For the men and women who had lived through it, however, the war remained a defining chapter of their lives. Veterans remembered the friends who had not come home. Survivors of bombings and camps carried nightmares into old age. Parents told their children stories of ration lines, of blackouts, of fear and resilience. Monuments rose, names were carved into stone, anniversaries were marked with solemn silence. And as the years passed, the war transformed from lived memory into history, from experience into lesson. But even as it became the subject of books, films, and lectures, its reality never lost its weight. For those who had lived it, World War II was not just history. It was the measure of what humanity could endure and inflict. It had begun with ambition, with dreams of empire and conquest, and it had ended in ruins, with nations divided and millions dead. But in the ashes, new beginnings were forged. The world of the mid-20th century, with its hopes and fears, its divisions and progress, was built on the foundation of those years of fire and blood. And though generations would come and go, the story of that war, the courage, the cruelty, the survival, and the sacrifice would echo on, not only in history books, but in the quiet determination of people everywhere to rebuild, to remember, and to hope. The world that emerged from the war was not simply rebuilt. It was reshaped, remade under pressures of memory, ideology, and necessity. If the 1,930 seconds had been a decade of uncertainty, depression, and rising dictatorships, Then, the late 1,940 seconds and 1,950 seconds were defined by a different tension. A world no longer at war, yet not at peace. It was a fragile balance, a twilight between the ashes of one conflict and the looming threat of another. Nations rebuilt with determination, but also with suspicion, glancing constantly over their shoulders at neighbors and rivals, wondering who would emerge as friend and who would reveal themselves as foe. For Europe, the greatest challenge was to rise from the ruins. The continent was a patchwork of shattered economies, broken families, and displaced peoples. The statistics themselves told a story of collapse. In France, agricultural output had fallen by nearly half, and many towns still bore scars of occupation. In Italy, hunger stalked the countryside, black markets thrived, and industries lay idle. Poland, ravaged by invasion, had lost millions of its people, and those who remained now faced the task of living amidst rubble. Czechoslovakia, Belgium, the Netherlands, all had suffered, and all struggled to reassert some sense of normal life. But nowhere was the challenge greater than in Germany. Defeated, occupied, and divided, it became the very heart of Europe's uncertainty. Millions of German civilians wandered through ruins, scavenging for food, bartering family heirlooms for bread, stripping wood from wrecked houses to burn for heat. Cities that had once boasted cathedrals and universities now stood as fields of debris. The Allies attempted denazification, purging the nation of its poisonous ideology, yet ordinary citizens could not so easily erase the memories of complicity, fear, and silence. At the same time, they faced shortages so severe that malnutrition and disease threatened to claim more lives even after the guns had stopped. For children, play often meant climbing piles of bricks, their laughter echoing strangely against hollow walls. For mothers, survival meant ingenuity, stretching rations, making soap from scraps, patching clothes from discarded uniforms. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, became a turning point. Billions of dollars in aid flowed from the United States into Western Europe, designed not only to rebuild but to stabilize, to prevent the hunger and despair that had once given rise to fascism from opening the door now to communism. New roads were laid, factories roared back to life, railways connected cities once more. Electricity lit up homes, shops reopened, and the first stirrings of consumer culture began to return. Coca-Cola, nylon stockings, and jazz music spread as symbols of a new era, proof that prosperity could be shared across the Atlantic. For Western Europe, it was not only rebuilding but a transformation, a step into modernity shaped by American influence. Eastern Europe, under Soviet domination, took a different path. Stalin's iron grip extended across Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Industries were nationalized, farms collectivized, dissent crushed by secret police. While factories rose and railways hummed, it was not prosperity but control that defined life behind the Iron Curtain. Propaganda promised a workers' paradise, but shortages, fear, and surveillance shaped daily existence. In East Berlin, statues of Marx and Lenin rose among ruins, while in Budapest and Prague, citizens whispered cautiously, careful of neighbors who might inform for the state. The war had ended, but a new line had been drawn. Invisible, yet unbreakable. The divide between East and West. In Asia, the scars were equally deep. China, already exhausted by years of war against Japan, was plunged almost immediately into civil conflict between nationalists and communists. Villages burned, armies clashed, and the people endured yet more years of upheaval. In Korea, once a colony of Japan, liberation quickly turned into division. The peninsula split along the 38th parallel, into North and South, each backed by rival superpowers. In Vietnam, the end of Japanese occupation brought not peace, but the stirrings of independence struggles, as Ho Chi Minh declared freedom from French rule. Asia, like Europe, was not free of conflict. It had only entered a new chapter, one where old colonial powers faced challenges from newly awakened nations. For Japan, defeat was followed by transformation unlike any in its history. The emperor, once divine, became a constitutional monarch. The nation disarmed, industries shifted to consumer goods, and a new constitution renounced war. American occupation brought reforms, but also humiliation, as foreign soldiers patrolled streets and occupied offices. Yet beneath the loss and trauma, Japan began a remarkable recovery. Within 2 decades, it would rise again, this time not as a military empire, but as an economic powerhouse. But in the late 1940s, it was still a land of scarcity. Families queued for rice, fishermen struggled to repair nets, and survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bore injuries and illnesses with quiet endurance. Their suffering became a silent reminder of war's ultimate cost, one etched not just in ruins but in flesh and memory. Across the globe, colonial subjects saw opportunity in the weakness of their European rulers. In India, independence came in 1947, though accompanied by the tragedy of partition. Millions fled across newly drawn borders between India and Pakistan, trains packed with refugees becoming rolling coffins as violence erupted. Yet independence was also a beacon, showing others that empires could be dismantled. In Indonesia, nationalist fighters resisted Dutch attempts to return. In Vietnam, the French faced a growing insurgency, and in Africa, voices of self-determination grew stronger year by year. The war had not only redrawn maps, it had redrawn imaginations, and peoples once bound to empire now believed freedom was possible. But even as nations looked to the Karagri's future, the memories of the war lingered in ways that were inescapable. In displaced persons camps, survivors of the Holocaust struggled to find new homes, many with nowhere to return. Entire families had been wiped out, communities erased. For some, emigration offered hope. Boats carried them to America, to Palestine, to new beginnings, far from the soil that had seen their destruction. Others stayed in Europe, rebuilding synagogues, schools, and businesses, determined to preserve what could be salvaged. Yet trauma remained. Nightmares haunted survivors, and silence often filled the spaces where words could not describe what they had endured. For veterans, too, adjustment was uneasy. They had lived through horrors that could not be put into words, and they returned to societies that often expected them to resume life as though nothing had happened. Men who had stormed beaches or marched across continents now found themselves behind desks, in factories, or on farms, haunted by memories of comrades lost. Many carried wounds that never fully healed, both physical and emotional. Some drank heavily, others withdrew into silence, and some sought solace in telling their stories, finding comfort only when they knew others had shared the same journey. And yet, amidst the scars, there was resilience. Children born during the war grew into a generation that knew hardship but also renewal. They played among ruins, went to schools, rebuilt from ashes, and watched as their countries slowly rose again. They were the generation of hope, their laughter a quiet defiance against the despair their parents had endured. Weddings were celebrated, songs were sung, art was created, and slowly, life reasserted itself. Gardens bloomed where craters had once scarred the earth. Markets reopened, their stalls filled with bread, fruit, and fish once more. For all its darkness, humanity had not lost its ability to rebuild, to begin again. In 1945, when the guns fell silent, it was said that the world had entered a new age. The age of total war had brought total devastation, but it had also forged an awareness that humanity's fate was shared. Atomic weapons had revealed the terrifying truth that one conflict could end not just nations, but civilization itself. This knowledge hung like a shadow over the decades to come, shaping diplomacy, culture, and everyday life. Schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills, politicians spoke of deterrence, and scientists warned of destruction even as they pursued discovery. The Second World War had ended, but it had not let go. It had merely changed its shape, its lessons lingering in every act of politics, every whisper of fear, every fragile hope for peace. And so, in the quiet of the late 1940s, as ruins slowly gave way to reconstruction, as grieving families carried on with trembling steps, the world lived in two times at once. It looked back at a war so vast and terrible it seemed almost beyond belief, and it looked forward to a future uncertain, balanced precariously between promise and peril. The scars of battle would remain for generations, written in stone, in memory, and in silence. But so too would the will to endure, to survive, and to hope. For if the war had shown the capacity for destruction, it had also revealed the resilience of the human spirit, a resilience that would carry the world into whatever came next. The last winter of the war in Europe was like the dying breath of a wounded giant, heavy and terrible, full of destruction and sorrow. Cities across the continent lay in ruins, and yet the fighting went on with a kind of grim inevitability. The German Reich, battered and bleeding, clung to survival with its last strength. In villages along the Rhine and in the forests of the Ardennes, in the frozen fields of Poland and the streets of Hungary, soldiers fought on though they knew the end was near. The air was sharp with smoke and frost, and every night the horizon flickered with the dull, orange glow of burning towns. Civilians wrapped themselves in rags against the cold, huddling in cellars and ruins, waiting for news, waiting for silence, waiting for the war to end. In December 1944, Hitler attempted one final gamble in the West. It came to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, and for a moment it seemed as if the Reich still had claws sharp enough to wound. German tanks rolled through the Ardennes forests under the cover of snowstorms, catching American lines off guard. Roads jammed with retreating convoys, villages changed hands in desperate clashes, and frozen fields were filled with the wreckage of tanks and trucks. For weeks the battle raged, the cold as much an enemy as the Germans themselves. Soldiers lived in foxholes, carved out of frozen earth, their breath hanging in the air, their bodies aching with exhaustion. Yet the Allies held, and when reinforcements poured in, the bulge in the line was pushed back. It was Germany's last offensive, the last roar of a fading storm. In the east, the Red Army advanced with a momentum that seemed unstoppable. Vast columns of men and machines rolled westward, the thunder of their artillery shaking the ground for miles. In January 1945, they launched a great offensive from the Vistula River, overwhelming German defenses and sweeping into Poland. The cities of Warsaw and Kraków fell, and with them came the liberation of camps that revealed horrors beyond imagination. Soviet soldiers stumbled into places of silence and death, places where ash clung to the ground, and the air carried the stench of what had been done. Survivors emerged like shadows, thin, hollow-eyed, their bodies scarred by starvation and cruelty. Word spread slowly, disbelievingly, of the scale of the crimes committed behind the barbed wire. For the first time, the world began to glimpse the full darkness of the Holocaust. Meanwhile, in the skies over Germany, Allied bombers roared day and night. The cities of Dresden, Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, all were reduced to ruins, their streets littered with rubble, their churches gutted, their homes burned. Firestorms swept through neighborhoods, pulling the air itself into whirlwinds of flame. Civilians crouched in cellars as the ground trembled, children covering their ears as the bombs fell, their small voices drowned by the roar of engines and explosions. For many, there was no escape. When the bombers passed, silence returned, broken only by the sound of collapsing walls and the cries of the wounded. Germany, once proud and defiant, was being pounded into submission. By April 1945, the Allies had crossed the Rhine. American and British soldiers pushed into the heart of Germany, moving through farmland, forests, and shattered towns. Everywhere they went, they found reminders of the regime they were defeating. Posters with fading slogans, abandoned weapons, civilians who watched in silence as foreign armies marched past. In some towns, white flags fluttered from windows, a sign that the inhabitants no longer wished to fight. In others, resistance was fierce. Fanatics and young boys pressed into service, holding rifles with trembling hands. The contrast was jarring. Some welcomed liberation, others clung to hopeless defiance. In Berlin, the end approached with thunder and smoke. Soviet artillery bombarded the city relentlessly, shells crashing into streets, tearing apart buildings already scarred by years of war. The air was thick with dust, and the nights were lit by flames. German soldiers, many of them mere teenagers, fought among the ruins, defending intersections, subway stations, and bridges with desperation. Civilians crowded into cellars, the ground above shaking with every explosion. The city became a labyrinth of rubble and barricades, its once grand avenues reduced to fields of stone. On April 30th, as Soviet troops closed in on the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler ended his life in his underground bunker. Outside, his empire crumbled. Within days, German forces across the country surrendered. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe was officially over. The celebrations that followed were overwhelming. In London, crowds gathered in Trafalgar Square, waving flags, singing songs, and embracing strangers. In Paris, church bells rang for the first time in years, their peals echoing across a city that had lived under occupation. In New York, ticker tape rained down as people poured into the streets, cheering, dancing, and shouting with relief. In Moscow, fireworks lit the sky, and soldiers marched proudly through Red Square. It was victory in Europe, a moment long dreamed of, and yet for many it was bittersweet. For every joyous cry, there was also silence homes, where fathers and sons would never return, places where loss was felt more deeply than triumph. The war was over, but the grief endured. But even as Europe rejoiced, the war raged on in the Pacific. There, the fighting had reached levels of brutality that defied belief. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa showed the Allies just how determined Japan was to resist. On Iwo Jima, the iconic image of Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi symbolized victory, but it came at the cost of thousands of lives. On Okinawa, American troops faced suicide charges, hidden bunkers, and kamikaze pilots who hurled themselves into ships, turning decks into infernos. The seas burned, the skies filled with fire, and the beaches ran red. Each island taken brought the Allies closer to Japan, but also revealed the terrible price an invasion of the home islands would demand. The decision to use the atomic bomb grew from this grim reality. American leaders calculated that an invasion might cost hundreds of thousands of lives, perhaps millions, if civilians joined in resistance. In secret, the Manhattan Project had produced a weapon unlike any other, a device that released the energy locked within atoms, unleashing destruction on an unimaginable scale. On August 6, 1945, the first of these weapons was used against the city of Hiroshima. In a blinding flash, the city was consumed. Buildings vanished, shadows were burned into walls, and tens of thousands of people were killed in an instant. Survivors stumbled through the ruins, their skin burned, their voices hoarse with cries. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. The world had entered the atomic age, and nothing would ever be the same again. Japan's surrender came soon after. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people, his voice heard by them for the first time. He spoke of enduring the unendurable, of laying down arms for the sake of survival. Across Asia and the Pacific, the guns finally fell silent. Prisoners of war stumbled out of camps, some so weak they could barely stand, their liberation both joyous and heartbreaking. Civilians emerged from shelters, blinking in the sunlight, daring to hope once more. In villages and cities, bells rang, lanterns were lit, and tears flowed freely. After nearly 6 years of global conflict, the Second World War had ended. The scale of the destruction was staggering. More than 70 million people had died, soldiers and civilians alike. Cities lay in ashes, entire nations uprooted, millions displaced from their homes. Families had been torn apart, cultures scarred, histories rewritten in fire and blood. Yet, amid the ruins, humanity endured. People began to rebuild, to clear rubble, to plant fields, to open schools. Life crept back into places where it seemed impossible. Children played among ruins, laughter echoing where bombs had fallen. The resilience of ordinary people became the quiet triumph of the post-war world. Yet the legacy of the war was not only destruction, but also transformation. The United Nations was founded, a global organization meant to prevent future conflicts and to safeguard peace. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted, proclaiming dignity and equality for all. War crimes, trials, held in Nuremberg, sought to hold leaders accountable, to declare that even in war, there were laws that must not be broken. At the same time, however, the seeds of a new conflict were already being sown. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union dissolved into suspicion and rivalry, each wary of the other's power. The Cold War began, a struggle of ideology and influence that would shape the second half of the 20th century. For survivors, the end of the war brought not only relief, but also memory. Veterans returned home carrying scars, both visible and hidden. Survivors of camps bore silence heavier than words, their stories too painful to tell, yet too important to forget. Families mourned their dead, lighting candles, erecting memorials, writing names on stone. The world promised never again, yet the promise depended on remembrance, on teaching the generations to come what had been endured and why it must not be repeated. And so, as the guns grew silent and the rubble slowly gave way to new buildings, the story of the war was carried forward in memory. It was told in books and diaries, in photographs and films, in the quiet whispers of grandparents to grandchildren. It lived in the monuments erected in towns and cities, in the flowers laid each anniversary, in the silence observed at memorials. The war had ended, but its shadow remained, a warning, a lesson, a reminder of both the depths of cruelty and the heights of resilience within humanity. The Second World War closed with destruction unmatched in history, but also with the fragile hope that from the ashes a new world could be built. It was a hope that ordinary men and women carried with them as they rebuilt their lives, a hope that leaders carried into new institutions, a hope that still whispers through the decades whenever the world remembers those years of fire and darkness. The world that emerged from the ashes of 1945 was scarred beyond recognition. And yet, in its brokenness, there was also a strange kind of rebirth. The cities of Europe and Asia lay in ruins, blackened by firestorms, streets choked with rubble, bridges blown apart. Fields were littered with rusting tanks. Trenches had become shallow graves, and whole landscapes had been reshaped by years of relentless combat. In some places, the land itself seemed exhausted, as if the earth bore scars alongside its people. But amid the ruins, life stirred once again. Farmers returned to charred fields, children searched through bombed houses for scraps of wood to build toys, and families, separated by war, struggled to find each other. The war had ended, but its shadow lingered everywhere. In Europe, the map itself was redrawn. The German Reich, once so vast and defiant, was divided, its leaders dead or imprisoned, its armies disbanded. Berlin, the heart of Hitler's dream, was now a city carved into zones, each controlled by one of the victorious allies. In the West, Britain, France, and the United States administered their sectors, while in the East, the Soviet Union imposed its will with a heavy hand. The Iron Curtain had not yet been named, but already it was descending, a line of suspicion and division stretching from the Baltic to the Adriatic. The war that had just ended seemed to give birth to another, this one colder, quieter, fought not with tanks and bombers but with spies, propaganda, and threats. Yet before that new conflict hardened, the world tried to reckon with what had just passed. The Nuremberg trials began in the autumn of 1945, held in the very city where Nazi rallies had once stirred vast crowds. Now, The hall was filled not with banners and torches, but with judges, prosecutors, and the accused. Leading figures of the regime sat in the dock, their faces drawn, their uniforms gone, their power reduced to silence. They listened as evidence of their crimes was read aloud, documents, photographs, testimony from survivors. The world heard, perhaps, fully for the first time, about gas chambers and death camps, about slave labor and mass shootings, about the machinery of genocide that had claimed millions of lives. Some defendants tried to excuse themselves, others remained defiant, but the verdicts were clear. Crimes against humanity had been committed, and the world declared that such crimes would not be forgotten. Elsewhere, people faced their own trials in quieter ways. In towns and villages across Europe, neighbors reckoned with betrayal and collaboration. Some who had survived the war returned home to find strangers living in their houses, their families gone, their lives uprooted. In France, women accused of collaborating with German soldiers were paraded through the streets, their heads shaved in acts of humiliation. In Eastern Europe, resistance fighters emerged from forests and fields, hailed as heroes, but often carrying wounds that never healed. Survivors of camps wandered back into society, thin and silent, carrying memories too heavy to share. For them, liberation was not the end of suffering, but the beginning of a long, painful journey toward life again. In Asia, the aftermath was equally turbulent. Japan, once proud and imperial, was reduced to ruins. Cities had been leveled by firebombing, and two had been obliterated by atomic blasts that introduced the world to a new and terrifying age. When Emperor Hirohito addressed his people to announce surrender, his voice trembled through radios across the country, and for many it was the first time they had ever heard him speak. The nation listened in shock and silence as he urged them to endure the unendurable. American forces soon occupied Japan, not as conquerors but as administrators of a new beginning. General Douglas MacArthur oversaw reforms that dismantled the military and reshaped the government. A new constitution promised democracy, and for the first time women were granted the right to vote. Yet amid these reforms, hunger and ruin haunted everyday life. Cities were rubble, industries collapsed, and people queued for hours for food. Across China and Southeast Asia, the end of Japanese occupation unleashed new struggles. Colonies long held by European powers now demanded independence. In Vietnam, Indonesia, India, and elsewhere, movements for freedom grew stronger. The Second World War had not only destroyed empires, but also loosened the chains of colonialism. A new tide of history was coming, one that would transform Asia and Africa in the decades ahead. The war had been global, and so too were its consequences. Back in the United States, soldiers returned home in their millions. They marched down main streets to cheering crowds, embraced their families on train platforms, and tried to fit back into lives that seemed changed forever. Some carried visible wounds, others invisible ones. Many had seen things they would never speak of: the beaches of Normandy, the jungles of the Pacific, the camps in Poland. They buried those memories deep, turning instead to the tasks of building families, finding jobs, and seeking peace in ordinary life. The GI Bill offered education and housing, fueling a boom that reshaped America into a land of suburbs and highways. Yet beneath the prosperity, questions lingered. African American soldiers who had fought for freedom abroad returned to a homeland still shackled by segregation. Women who had worked in factories and offices during the war found themselves pushed back into homes, their wartime independence slipping away. The war had ended, but the struggles for equality and justice continued. In Britain, the mood was different. The victory had been glorious, but the cost had been enormous. Cities were shattered, industries strained, and rationing continued for years after the war. The empire, once so vast, was beginning to wane. Yet there was also a spirit of determination to rebuild. In 1945, the Labour Party swept to power, promising a new society built on fairness. The National Health Service was created, offering health care for all. a legacy born out of the war's suffering. From the rubble, a new vision of community and solidarity emerged. Everywhere, the war left behind ghosts. In Germany, millions of displaced persons wandered across the landscape, former prisoners, forced laborers, refugees, fleeing, advancing armies. Camps were set up not for imprisonment but for shelter, as the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration tried to provide food, clothing, and medical care. Families searched for missing loved ones, posting names on lists and boards, clinging to the hope that someone might still be alive. For many, the answers never came. The world also had to face the new reality of nuclear weapons. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had shown what was possible, and now scientists, politicians, and citizens alike grappled with the implications. Could such weapons be controlled? Would they be used again? The United States had the bomb, but soon the Soviet Union would have it too. The balance of power shifted, and the shadow of atomic war loomed over the coming decades. Humanity had survived one global war, but it now lived with the knowledge that the next might end everything. And yet, despite the fears and the grief, there was hope. In San Francisco in 1945, delegates from 50 nations gathered to sign the Charter of the United Nations. They spoke of a world where disputes could be resolved without war, where nations could work together to prevent aggression and protect human rights. It was an imperfect beginning, but it was also a declaration that humanity would try again, that peace was worth striving for. For those who had lived through the war, memory became a duty. Veterans told their stories, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes with urgency. Survivors of camps bore witness to horrors that many at first could not believe. Writers, filmmakers, and historians tried to capture the scale of what had happened, though words often felt inadequate. Monuments rose over battlefields and cemeteries, names carved in stone so they would not be forgotten. Each year, on anniversaries, people paused in silence, remembering not only victory but also loss. The war had reshaped the world in every way, politically, socially, technologically. It had brought out the worst of humanity and also the best. It had shown the depths of cruelty, but also the resilience of ordinary men and women who endured, who fought, who rebuilt. And though it ended with fire and ash, it also opened the possibility of a new beginning. As night fell on the first years of peace, the world was quieter, though never truly at rest. Children were born who would never know the thunder of bombers or the rumble of tanks, though they would live in a world shaped by them. Cities were rebuilt, fields replanted, and nations reimagined. From the rubble of the most destructive war in history, humanity stepped forward, uncertain, scarred, but alive. The Second World War had been a storm that engulfed the globe, but storms always pass. What remains afterward is the task of rebuilding, of remembering, of ensuring that the lessons paid for in blood are not lost. The men and women of that generation carried the weight of those years with them, and through their stories, their silence, and their resilience, they passed that weight to us. It is left for us to carry the memory, to understand the fragility of peace, and to honor those who lived and died in those years of fire. And so the story of the war closes, not with a neat ending, but with echoes that continue to this day. It ends with streets rebuilt where rubble once lay, with children playing where soldiers once fought, with silence over fields where guns once roared. It ends with the knowledge that even in the darkest times, humanity endured, and that from the ruins of destruction, a fragile but enduring hope was born.